Story 1. I wake up in a void. White light envelops me from all sides, and I can't tell where this world begins and ends. There is no floor, no ceiling, only a brightness that seems endless, like silence itself. My eyes can't fixate on a single object, only a blinding glow that eclipses everything around me. I don't know how much time has passed, but I feel like I haven't been here for long. My lungs fill with air, and I feel their lightness, as if all the weight of the world has lost its meaning. I try to concentrate, but instead of understanding anything, I just float. I move as if in water, although there is none here. I don't understand why I feel this way. I can't remember who I am or why I'm here. Only loneliness and a strange feeling of emptiness surround me. It seems that I am in between, in some kind of nothingness. This place has no form, but it pulls me deep inside itself. I can't stop. I don't want to stop. My movements are not exactly swimming, more like running, only I don't touch the ground. It all became so natural that I don't wonder why I don't feel tired or afraid. I kept moving, swimming, until I noticed something strange, faint, like a shadow, but not quite a shadow. In the distance, I saw a tiny orange flame that pulsed slightly, as if it were alive. It beckoned to me, like a signpost leading in the direction. I didn't know what it was, but I intuitively understood that it was my landmark. I walked toward the light, although anxiety was swaying inside me. What if this wasn't what I was looking for? But my steps continued to move in that direction. For some reason, I knew that I had to go, despite the fact that everything inside screamed fear. It was unclear, but strong, like a premonition of something terrible hidden behind the door. As I approached, I saw not just a light, but a door like in old movies, with massive handles and creaking hinges tied around it. I stopped in front of it, feeling how it suddenly eclipsed everything else. I didn't know what was behind it. I was afraid it might be something I didn't want to know, but there was no other way. I knew I had to open it. If I didn't open it, I wouldn't know, and I wouldn't go any further. I reached for the doorknob, but my heart was beating so fast I could feel it pounding in my temples. I took a step back. Everything inside me was resisting. What if this was a trap? What if there was something terrible behind that door? But despite all my confusion and doubt, I still made a decision. I opened the door, and as soon as I opened it, heat hit me in the face. It was a sharp, almost physical blow, as if I found myself under a blazing sun, unprepared for such brightness. I recoiled, but still stepped through the threshold, because there was no other way. The cool air outside felt strangely familiar. I raised my head and looked around. What I saw stunned me. This was not the world I expected. I stood in a room that felt both familiar and alien. A fire was burning in the fireplace, crackling and emitting a warm light. But in front of me on the floor was a small puddle of water. I looked at my feet, which were covered in something wet. A strange feeling came over me as I realized that the water I had been engulfed in was gone. And now, standing in this familiar place, I could feel it disappearing. I turned around and suddenly my memories started flashing like sparks. It was unclear, like frames from an old movie. I saw a couple of people dancing in a dark hall, and the sound of the music was distorted and muffled. Suddenly I heard some voices. It was strange and inexplicable. I ran to the windows, not understanding what I was doing. Pain pierced me like a blow. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold fear, as if someone was tearing me apart from the inside. I heard thunder echoing in the gray sky, and the lights began to flicker, flashing like lightning. A crowd of people were trying to get out of the rain, and I could see their confusion. The voices were getting louder, and the fear was growing. I couldn't understand what was happening, but this was not the time to think. This was the time to act, to run. I realized that these memories, these images, were not just pictures of the past. They were more. I was looking for answers, but they were hidden in the mist, and all I could do was move on, following these vague tracks that led me somewhere where the truth might be waiting for me. My head was spinning, but I knew I couldn't stop, and I didn't. I continued walking, not knowing what I was looking for, but feeling that wherever I went, it was not the end. Everything in this world was so unusual, so strange, that I could not understand what was happening. With each new step, I felt my fear and uncertainty increase, but despite this, something unknown drew me further. The path I was walking was like a labyrinth. The reality around me was changing every moment, as if the emptiness itself was trying to pull me in. The walls around me, which had been cold and hard just a few seconds ago, were now bending and becoming soft like fabric, changing shape under my steps. I was left in this shaky world where there was no time, no space, no meaning. Everything was just a sensation, like a fog in the head that hides the appearance of reality. The light kept changing. In one place it was warm, like a sunset. In another it was bright and sharp, like the sun's rays. I kept moving, intuitively knowing that I needed to look for something more than just following these lights. I felt a strange pull toward one of them. It was the same light that was pulling me again. I moved closer and suddenly felt its powerful radiance swallow me whole. And so I found myself in a new place. It was a huge hall. The walls were covered with stone slabs, on which one could see ancient patterns. They were swayed-like, as if time and aging had left marks on them that they had not even tried to erase. In the center of the hall stood a majestic table, surrounded by empty chairs. The table was ancient, covered with a thick layer of dust, and on its surface lay a map, spread out like an ancient scroll. It depicted lines and symbols that I could not decipher. I approached and bent down, trying to make out at least something familiar. My fingers slid across the surface of the map. As soon as I touched it, the world around me began to change. The colors began to fade, and the space around me seemed to distort, as if someone had decided to compress it to an infinite point. I felt a slight vibration in my hands and then a sound, quiet, barely audible. It was something like a whisper that came from the very depths. I looked around, trying to find the source of the sound, but everything was empty and lifeless. The silence was deafening. Everything around me seemed motionless, but at the same time there was some kind of tension, as if something unknown was watching my every move. I felt my heart begin to beat faster, and my breathing became heavy. I realized that I was in this place for a reason. I was a part of something, and something was ready to show me. Then I noticed how one of the floor tiles under my feet began to vibrate slightly. It moved away, and a stream of cold air burst out from under it, filling the space around. I didn't know what it meant, but my body automatically stepped forward. I couldn't stop, as if this moment was predetermined, and I had no right to return. I peered through the crack in the floor, and there in the darkness was a silhouette. It was dim, barely visible, but I could feel its presence. It was not human, but it was alive. Its figure seemed familiar to me, although I could not say why. It did not move, did not make a sound, but I knew that it was waiting for me. I took a step forward, and suddenly everything around me began to disappear. The floor disappeared, the walls blurred, and the hall itself began to disappear into the darkness. But the silhouette remained, as if it were pulling me along like a magnet, not giving me the opportunity to return. I felt it pulling me deeper, and then it became clear to me that this was not the end, but only the beginning. I could not understand what this creature was, but it was part of this emptiness. All this time I was part of something much greater than I could imagine. Then I realized that I didn't need to look for answers to the questions. The answers were already inside me. When I first came here, I didn't know where I was. I didn't understand how I got here. The whole world seemed foggy and blurry, as if I was standing on the edge of sleep and reality. Every step was difficult. Every glance was uncertain. The sky I saw was a different color. It wasn't blue, it wasn't gray, it wasn't even black. It was some strange shade that couldn't exist in the ordinary world. It seemed to be an interweaving of all possible colors, but at the same time it wasn't any of them. I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and it seemed to me that if I took a step forward, I would dissolve into this sky, disappear like a bubble in water. There was nothing around me, no sounds, no smells, no movement, just emptiness and me. But the strangest thing was that I didn't feel fear. On the contrary, I felt some strange, calm determination, as if I knew that this place was my destiny, and now I had to be here. My memory was fragmentary. I remembered only small fragments of my life. At first, it was bits and pieces of my childhood, running through green fields, my friends laughing, the pride I felt in my first bike race. It all seemed so distant, so non-existent. Then my memory would take me to later times, my last meetings, conversations with people who no longer mattered, and then it would all disappear, leaving only a void, as if someone had wiped the slate clean and erased everything I knew. I looked up, and there in the very center of this strange world, a figure appeared. At first I couldn't tell what it was, because the figure was indistinct, as if its image had no clear boundaries. It was blurred, as if painted with water. But then I realized it was a being, and it was approaching me. The air around me became heavy in its presence, as if its weight were pressing down on me. I froze, unable to look away. Something inside me told me that this being was connected to me. It wasn't just strange, it was more than I could have imagined. My thoughts began to wander. I couldn't focus. My body, like my memories, seemed foreign to me. I tried to step back, but I couldn't. Everything around me was like a magical barrier, preventing me from moving to the side. I stood motionless, as if something invisible was holding me back. I wanted to scream, but the sound I tried to make didn't leave my throat. I was trapped in this emptiness, with this creature that was approaching. I tried to figure out what this creature was. Its outline was becoming clearer with each passing moment. moment, but its face remained hidden, as if it were covered in shadow. It did not move quickly, but each step seemed somehow inevitable. It was walking towards me, but not with the intention of hurting me. It was not hostile, but it was not kind either. It was neutral, like something that existed beyond goodness and evil. When it came close enough to me, I realized that everything I felt was connected to this being. It was part of this world, and I was part of this world. It stood before me, and although I could not understand its intentions, I felt that it was the one who could tell me what was happening to me, what I had to do. Her eyes, I finally saw the creature's eyes. They were a bright green, deep as the ocean, but with an eerie coldness that made my heart beat faster. I couldn't look away even if I tried. Every moment I spent looking into those eyes seemed to take a piece of my life away. But at the same time, I couldn't stop looking. I felt images appear in my head, like flashes of memories and intuitive realizations. The creature took a step towards me and touched me. Its touch was cold but not painful. It left no marks on my skin, but I felt it penetrate inside me, as if it were extracting my past, my experiences, my deepest fears and desires. "You are here because you need to understand," it whispered. And though it was not a verbal message, I understood it. The words penetrated my mind as if they were independent of me. I felt that this entity knew me more than I knew myself. I was silent, but my mind was screaming. Why am I here? Why do I have to stand in front of this creature? What should I do? The creature continued to look at me. Its eyes were still deep and unknown, but now I felt that it was not simply watching me. It was waiting for my answer. And I understood. It was a moment when I had to make a choice. Not a conscious one, not a thoughtful one. Just a choice. To stay in this void, where there is nothing but me and the creature, or to jump into the unknown, forgetting about everything that came before. I raised my hand and stepped forward. As soon as I took a step, I felt the world around me change. Everything that had been there before, the strange sky, the emptiness, the creature, disappeared. And I found myself in another place, completely different from where I had been before. The space around me was dark, but not gloomy. There was no bright light, but there was no complete darkness either. Everything was like in a semi-darkness, where details are difficult to discern, but the world itself still seemed alive. I looked around, trying to figure out where I was, but I couldn't find a single familiar detail. The ground beneath my feet was soft as sand, but it left no traces, as if it were not material. Strange shapes that I could barely make out flashed on the horizon, like abstract silhouettes. This place was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. It was as if I was in an alien world, but at the same time it was a world that existed in the deepest corners of my mind. And again I felt that same strange, deep gaze that seemed to watch me from the shadows. I turned and saw that the creature was there again. Its eyes were the same bright green, just as cold and penetrating. It stood motionless, but I knew that it was watching my every move. I froze, trying to comprehend what was happening. This place was not a dream, but it was not reality in the usual sense either. It was something in between. I did not know what to do, but I felt that something important was waiting for my choice. "You cannot return," the creature said, and its words were as silent as before, but I felt them as if they had passed right through me, filling my thoughts. "You cannot leave without choosing. You stand at the threshold. This is a place for those who choose." I didn't know what it meant. My head was full of questions, but they all remained unanswered as before. Why am I here? Why was I chosen? And most importantly, what should I do next? The creature continued to look at me, and its gaze grew heavier. I felt it penetrating me, as if it wanted me to feel not only its presence, but the very essence of what I was experiencing. Its gaze was at once chillingly cold and strangely comforting, as if it were searching for something in me that I could not understand. I knew that the decision I was about to make was not simply a choice between roads. It was something deeper. It was a test I could not avoid. I felt everything around me beginning to shrink, time and space seeming to flow faster than I would like. It was a sense that I was on the threshold of something far more important than I could have imagined. At some point, I realized that I was not alone in this choice. It was not just my decision. Everything I was experiencing, everything I was feeling, did not come from me alone. It was part of something bigger, which encompassed this entire world, this emptiness, this space. My choice was important not only for me, it was important for everything that was here, for everything that I could not understand. But what could I do? I didn't know what to do. I felt how the creature was waiting for an answer from me, how its gaze was full of this viscous insistence. I could no longer remain silent. What should I choose? I finally asked. But it wasn't the voice I expected to hear. My own voice seemed foreign to me, as if I were speaking through someone else, as if I couldn't make the decision myself. The creature did not respond with words. Instead, it simply stepped toward me, and as if waiting for my movement, touched me. Its touch was soft, like mist, but at the same time felt like something hard and inescapable. In that moment, I felt my entire body tighten, as if I had lost control over it. Everything inside me began to flow, to merge like a river that cannot hold its current. I felt it entering me again. But this time it wasn't just a touch. It was an awareness, a feeling that I was part of this world. The being, this place, everything that was happening here was connected to me. And I couldn't fight it. I couldn't stop what was happening, and I couldn't understand how or why I was here. I stood in this place, and the feeling of it drew me deeper and deeper. And suddenly I understood. My choice was not just a choice, it was the key to my understanding of everything. And all I had to do was understand what it meant. I stood there trying to collect my thoughts. Everything around me continued to pulse, as if space itself was alive. The sky I had seen before now became even more hazy and inexplicable. The dark shapes I had taken for silhouettes began to move, as if they were part of the very reality I found myself in. An alien sense of inevitability filled me, and I understood. This world did not want to let me go. The creature didn't move. It continued to look at me, and its eyes were filled with the same indescribable heaviness that I had felt from the beginning. It was more than just an observer. It was part of this emptiness, and it seemed that I was becoming part of it too. My hands began to shake, though I couldn't explain why. I wasn't sure what I was feeling. Fear, confusion, or something deeper that I couldn't put into words. But whatever it was in my body, in every cell, in every breath. And the being in front of me wouldn't let go of it. I thought about my life, about how I got here. What if this was all just a game? Could I choose, or was it all predetermined? My mind refused to comprehend that my choice could be important not only to me, but to everything I had experienced here. What if I could actually change the course of events? What if right now, where I would go next was being decided? The creature before me slowly moved its head, as if in response to my thoughts. It offered me no clues, no help. Only its gaze, which seemed to penetrate deeper than I could have imagined. I felt it yearning for an answer from me, but what choice could I make? Did I even have a choice? Suddenly, the space around me began to change. The world I had been trying so hard to understand began to dissolve into a new light. Its blurry outlines began to stretch and solidify into something more concrete. It became difficult to maintain focus. I watched as the ground beneath my feet began to crack, as light lines cut through the dark skies, and new shapes began to emerge before me. It wasn't just a change in space, it was a change in everything. I felt a change happening, something deep in this place changing, pulling me into something bigger than just the world, bigger than just reality. It was about me, about my thoughts, about my feelings, about my doubts and insecurities. I was becoming part of it, and the more I resisted, the more I was drawn in. The creature still stared at me, but its gaze was no longer cold. It was almost human. No, not human, but something I could understand. There was desperation and weariness in its eyes. It too was unsure of what was happening, and that gaze seemed to tell me that I was not alone in this. We were all part of something greater and inevitable. I realized that I was facing a choice not only for myself. My decision could affect this world, this process, the very fabric of reality that surrounded me, and all I could do was simply accept it. My hands stopped shaking. I felt something changing inside me. The fear I had felt before was now a fog, dissolving into thin air. I realized that I could not change what was happening. This was not a moment to fight. This was a moment to simply agree, to accept my role in this vast, all-consuming process. I took a deep breath, and in that moment, everything around me seemed to stop. Space, time, reality itself, everything froze. The being standing before me did not move. Everything was silent, as if the world was preparing to hear my answer. I looked at the creature and realized that my choice had already been made. And although I couldn't understand what that choice was, I knew it was the right move. I couldn't go back. I couldn't refuse. I was a part of this. The creature nodded slowly, as if confirming what I already knew. And in that moment, the world around me began to change. The dark shapes disappeared, replaced by clear, distinct forms. I felt the pressure on my chest ease. My choice had been made, and everything began to calm down. The creature disappeared as silently as it had appeared, leaving me standing in this new changed world. Now I was ready. I stood there watching the world around me continue to change. Every step, every glance seemed to dissolve further into a strange, foggy atmosphere where reality had no shape to it. Everything I had once known phone was slowly slipping away, like sand through my fingers. The feeling of emptiness was not leaving me, but now it was not just a feeling, it was a part of me. My body, which had once seemed so alive and strong, became clumsy. It was as if it was losing its solidity and instead becoming light as a feather, ready to fly away in any direction. I didn't know what was happening. My thoughts were getting confused, and my mind was trying to grasp even a small part of what was happening around me. But it was only enough for one thing: experience. I felt it on a deep level. There was something before me that I still couldn't fully comprehend, a being that had been my only familiar landmark in this alien world. It was there, but now its shape was becoming less clear, its silhouette blurring, dissolving like smoke slipping through my fingers. It was more than just a being, it was part of the very reality I was experiencing. I felt myself being consumed by this process. I seemed to be disappearing, like a figure etched in a vacuum, and the world around me became even more alien. Walls that were once familiar began to slowly warp. The sky I had seen before was now covered in shades that did not exist on Earth. It was so strange and impossible. I could not tell if it was beautiful or scary. I did not know what to feel. Everything was intangible, and I myself felt like a part of this chaos, a mere point in the universe, surrounded by emptiness. At some point, I realized that I was no longer part of the past. All that was left was now. This moment, it had completely consumed me, and I couldn't remember who I had been before. There was no time, no space, no point of reference. I was here, and that was all that mattered. And the world around me, this strange, unnatural reality, kept changing. It was hard to tell what was happening, but one thing was clear to me: I was not alone. The creature that was still there now seemed to be part of these changes. It moved, but not in the way I understood movement. Its form expanded and contracted, as if it were not physical, but part of the very energy of this world. I tried to understand what this meant. What did it want from me? Or maybe it didn't want anything. Maybe it simply existed the way everything here existed, without beginning or end, without meaning or purpose. It was part of the very fabric of this world. I felt something inside me begin to melt, as if I myself was becoming part of this restless, twisted space. My thoughts began to tangle in this whirlpool. I could no longer control them. They merged into one continuous wave, into one all-encompassing state. I was no longer an observer. I became part of this process, part of this moment. Suddenly, I felt something change. A moment. It felt like something important had happened, but I couldn't figure out what it was. The creature had stopped moving. It stood before me, and although I still couldn't figure out its intentions, I felt like it was waiting for something. Perhaps this was the moment I should have realized that I could no longer go back. But what was ahead? And what did my role in this vast, incomprehensible process mean? I looked at the creature and suddenly realized that everything I had felt was not a coincidence. I was here for a reason. Everything I had experienced was connected to something greater than myself. I was part of something greater that could not be explained within the framework of my old understanding of the world. My fear and doubt were just the consequences of my inability to understand it. But at some point, they began to disappear. I was no longer afraid. I was ready. The creature took a step forward, and at that moment, the space around me changed dramatically. Everything around me became clearer. I saw reality around me shrink, as if I myself were at the center of this new world. The creature disappeared as silently as it had appeared, leaving me standing in this new place. The world around me was not the same as before. It was complex, multi-layered, but now I could feel that this new world was me. It was a part of me, and I was a part of it. And in that moment, I realized that I had come to my new beginning. It was chaos. Everything around me was fuzzy, like smoke, and I could feel the reality beneath my feet beginning to lose its familiar density. It was as if I was beginning to blur, becoming part of something vast and incomprehensible. I knew something had happened, something irreversible, but I couldn't figure out what it was. The world around me grew darker, as if the night itself had crept into my consciousness, eclipsing everything bright and clear. Sounds that I had previously perceived as normal, footsteps, breathing, the cracking of branches, became unnatural, blurred, as if they had no meaning. I could no longer hear my own breath. Everything around me was consumed by emptiness, and I felt it enveloping me, subduing me. My eyes could no longer discern details. Every face, every object around me became part of this fog. I moved in this strange world as if I were on the edge of a dream and reality, with no clear idea of where I ended and where the surrounding space began. Every movement seemed unnatural, Everything happened in slow time, as if everything around me was not real. It was like that moment when you see everything that once seemed stable crumble. At first you don't notice the change, and then suddenly you realize it has happened. I felt the walls of my existence begin to crumble. I tried to hold on to something real, but all I could feel was emptiness. The space I was in began to shrink and expand, as if it defied the laws of physics. I tried to remember what happened before, but all my memories began to blur, as if they were leaking out of my head, leaving only an empty space. There was no fear, no pain. I felt no time reference, no physical contact with the world. I was part of something that was beyond comprehension. And in this emptiness, there was only one sensation. I was alone, absolutely alone in this strange world. All that remained was a sense of presence, as if I were an observer, and at the same time a part of this that I was observing. The creature appeared again. I felt its presence, although I could not see it exactly. It was here, but at the same time, it was not here. I could not understand its form, and it seemed to be unwilling to reveal its essence either. It was something that stood behind this world, but at the same time it had no clear outline. I could not describe it. I could not give it a name. It was something that existed outside of logic and meaning. Something stirred inside me. I realized that this wasn't just a shadow or hallucination. This was something bigger, something that was part of me. I was no longer an observer, no longer an outsider in this place. I was at the center of it all, and I had to figure out what it meant. The world around me changed again. It became brighter. The contours became clearer, and I felt the space fill with air again. I inhaled, but this air was not like the air I knew. It was strange, heavy, as if every molecule of this air was part of the very being I felt next to me. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. They were tied to the ground. I stood there not knowing where to go, what to do. The creature had moved again. Its presence was growing stronger. It was part of every movement of air, every sound, every breath. I felt it sucking me in, like a funnel that left me with no choice. At some point, I realized that I couldn't go back. Everything that had happened before no longer mattered. I was in a new place, and all that was left was to accept what was happening, to accept it as an inevitable part of my existence. And so, in that moment, I felt that I was no longer part of the past. I became part of this strange, incomprehensible world. And although I could not understand it entirely, I knew that I was now part of it. Story 2. Standing at the window of my office, I looked at the city. It was so quiet, so perfect. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't find anything superfluous here. All the streets, buildings, and even the sky beyond the glass walls were like paintings, built with a special calculation. It was a place where there was no chance. Everything from the surface to the depths had its own order, its own meaning, its own purpose. When I came to this city, I was not prepared to see it like this. There were many ambitions, aspirations, ideas in my head. But now, years later, I understood. This was my legacy, my work. I knew that without this world, I would not be myself. Looking at the empty streets, I felt how everything in me calmed down. It was a place where there was no struggle, no fear. Everything that happened here happened according to the rules that I set myself, and the world in which I lived became familiar to me. In the past, I was probably like everyone else, restless, full of questions and doubts. But now, standing here, in the midst of all this perfection, I felt no hesitation. This world was precise, and I was its creator. I remembered how it all began. It was a long time ago, in the days when I didn't yet know how deep my beliefs, my desires could be. I was just a man standing at a crossroads, and that was before I understood that the world had to change. Back then, I didn't yet know that in order to make the world perfect, you have to destroy everything that was in it before. I took a deep breath, feeling the silence in the air. It wasn't just emptiness, it was the silence that came with victory. Not victory over an enemy, but over what had come before. Victory over myself. I was part of the system, part of this great mechanism, but despite this, I still felt a little detached, as if I were watching something from the outside. There was no sense of anxiety or worry. Everything that happened was predictable. Everything made sense. I walked through my office, my gaze sliding over the shelves filled with numerous books and protocols. Every movement in this world had its purpose. I continued to create, knowing that this process was eternal. I was the one who controlled it. I was the one who could destroy everything that did not correspond to the ideal. I remembered the moments when the first steps in this direction were taken, when we began to cleanse the earth, when we began to destroy old systems, old beliefs, old forms of life. It was not easy. The whole world resisted, but I knew it had to be this way. In the end, the result justified everything. I thought about those who had died in the process, those who had failed to adapt, who had failed to understand that change was inevitable. I still felt the pain then, but now, years later, I felt no pity, no regret. I knew it had all been necessary. The world could not move forward without breaking old bonds. People could not grow if they clung to the past. The images came back to me. The old cities, their streets, their people, ordinary people. We had freed them from their fears, from their delusions. The world was full of disease, violence, hatred. It could not continue as it was. We had offered them a way out. We had given them a new path. And here I stood, years later, among the buildings I had built, feeling this pride, this satisfaction. But there was no joy. I didn't feel a sense of celebration. I didn't feel a sense of elation. Everything was just as it was supposed to be. The world was smooth and calm, but it wasn't because it was beautiful. It was because I was in control of it. I sat in my chair looking around the office that had become my personal temple. In the silence in the air, I felt that I would never return to my old life. Everything was decided. This was no place for regrets. It was mine, and I was its master. The world was mine now, and it would probably never be the same again. I had created it the way it was meant to be, a system that allowed for no chance, no mistakes, no fear. A world where there was no room for the weak, no room for doubt. A world where I could finally breathe easy, knowing that everything would be exactly as I had decided. As time went on, I felt more and more that the familiar world was losing its appeal. I wasn't sure what had changed, but something inside me was shifting. It wasn't the usual feeling of tiredness or irritation. It was like a gentle pressure that I couldn't explain. Sometimes looking out the window, it seemed to me that I wasn't seeing the world I had built, but something alien, as if someone had placed my reflection on its surface, and it didn't match me. I continued my work despite this feeling. Everything remained as precise, as perfect. But occasionally I noticed that these perfections were beginning to lose their magic. Everything that had seemed ideal before began to raise the question, why? Why should I return to these rituals, these tasks, these results, if I myself do not feel their meaning? I spent my days in constant activity, but my mind was empty. Sometimes I found myself sitting in my office, not understanding what I should do next. Things that used to fill me with joy and satisfaction now became mechanical. They were just part of the routine, part of the process. They left no trace in me, no excitement or pride. The day I first realized this, I was standing by the window, but I didn't feel the connection I was used to with the world. I didn't know what had happened, but something had changed. I couldn't decide what. Maybe it was an emptiness that had filled the place of a sense of fulfillment. Maybe it was an unconscious yearning for something more. But whatever it was, I knew one thing. I couldn't stay here. I still saw the world I had created in all its elements, but it was no longer the place I had come to call home. I felt a crack in the world, and that crack was in my own heart. It was a strange realization. I, who had been a master of order and control, was confronted with the chaos hidden deep within me. It was excruciating, but also liberating in a way. I couldn't stay in this void, but I didn't know how to get out of it. I felt like I was trapped in my own body and mind, trying to find some way out of this state. I was no longer the same person who had taken pride in creating this perfect world. There was no confidence inside me anymore, no goal that I could continue to pursue. Everything seemed too distant and alien. Often I would go for walks along the empty streets where no one walked anymore. They were as empty as everything I felt inside. There were no more people, no more life. Everything was exactly as I wanted it to be, but I no longer knew what to do with it. I could hardly contain the desire to go beyond these walls, beyond the ideal that I had created. What if everything was not so perfect on the other side? What if there was an emptiness that I could not fill? Or maybe I was ready for that. One day, sitting in my office, I realized that I was on the brink of something bigger. Not something I could control, not something I could fix through effort or willpower. It was something bigger than myself, and whatever it was, I could feel it coming. Maybe it was the end. Maybe it was a new chapter, but I knew I had to choose. I could either stay in this world I had created and continue to destroy everything that remained, or I could find a new path, despite the emptiness that now surrounded every step. I stood by the window, feeling time begin to lose its meaning. The clock that had once guided me now seemed irrelevant. I had lost my sense of time, my sense of place. Everything was just part of an empty picture, part of something that didn't matter. And yet, despite the emptiness, despite the uneasiness that was beginning to build, I knew that this uncertainty couldn't last forever. Too much had gone into creating this world to just leave it like this. I had to make a choice, no matter how difficult it was. But for now, I stood here, watching as the world I had created continued to exist despite my doubts. I didn't know what was coming next, but I felt it was going to be something great. It was going to be a step into the unknown, and I was going to be ready for it. With each passing day, I felt the world around me grow dimmer. The shadows on the horizon grew longer, and every step I took echoed in the void. But it wasn't just loneliness. It was a sense that something in this place no longer belonged to me. What had seemed solid and unchanging was beginning to disintegrate into tiny pieces. I tried not to think about it as I went about my daily business, but I couldn't ignore the tension I felt with every breath. I decided to go outside. Perhaps the fresh air and open spaces would help clear my head. The city was the same as before, but now it seemed foreign. It wasn't the result of any changes. Literally nothing had changed. People went about their business, cars moved along the streets, trees stood as they always had. But it all looked like a set, like a carefully chosen stage for a play. I stood in the middle of it all, but none of it belonged to me. I was there, but it was as if I wasn't. Walking the streets became a new challenge for me. Every step, every movement left a trace that seemed increasingly meaningless. I tried to find answers to the questions that arose in my head, but the more I searched, the more uncertainty there became. This world I had created no longer made sense. But why? Why was this happening? And most importantly, how can I stop this process? I came to the park. Sitting down on one of the benches, I looked at the trees, the grass, the wind rustling the leaves. Everything looked as it should be, but inside me, everything was seething. I felt like this was not my place. I couldn't find peace in this world because everything in it reminded me of the emptiness that was growing inside me. I looked around and realized that no external changes mattered anymore. I was looking for answers not in the world around me, but within myself. And then, as usually happens in such moments, I realized that it was the internal conflict that was the source of all my torment. I could no longer ignore the fact that I had lost touch with what used to be important to me. My ideals, my goals, my foundations. They were becoming increasingly unreal. I began to understand that it was I who had created this world, this life, this emptiness. And now I was faced with a choice: to continue living according to the old rules that no longer made sense, or to break this circle and start anew with a clean slate. At that moment, I felt fear creeping up on me. It wasn't the fear I'd known before, the kind I'd dealt with by simply pushing through it. It was fear of the unknown, of what lay beyond the familiar world. I felt like I'd come too far to turn back. My whole life had been built on certain principles and expectations, but now those principles weren't satisfying. They were just making me feel lost. I stood up and started walking again. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I felt like I needed to search. Maybe it would lead me to something important, or maybe just to a new state of peace that I was missing. The evening was already approaching on the horizon. The sky was covered with clouds and the twilight was slowly descending on the city. I felt how everything around me was beginning to disappear into the semi-darkness. I did not know what awaited me, but I knew that it was impossible to continue living according to the old patterns. I could no longer live with the shadows that had become my companions. The time had come. Everything I knew was in the past, and maybe that was what I needed to understand. The world I had created was no longer mine, and I was ready to accept that there was something bigger just beyond the horizon, something I hadn't seen yet, but that I felt inside. Maybe it was liberation, maybe it was a new path, but I knew one thing: I couldn't stay here, in this world I had built, and let it crumble without doing something. I decided to move on. With every step I took, the feeling of emptiness grew deeper. The world around me continued to move, and yet it felt like I was outside of it. I was part of something I couldn't understand and couldn't change. In this strange, almost silent state, I began to realize that everything I thought I knew about myself and the world no longer mattered. Nothing could bring back the sense of purpose I once felt. And so at some point, I realized that I didn't exist in the way I wanted to. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I needed. Day turned to night, and I found myself back in the empty city streets, lit by the dim light of street lamps. I didn't try to find an explanation for what was happening. I no longer sought answers, didn't demand them from the world. I began to accept that perhaps there was nothing in this world that could satisfy my anxiety. My gaze wandered to dark corners, and in those shadows I began to see familiar figures. But I couldn't tell if they were reflections of my own doubts or actual creatures lurking in those dark places. I felt their presence, as if someone was waiting for me around every corner. Sometimes I would meet people I passed without looking at them, and in these fleeting encounters, I felt the world blur, and the faces I saw became blurred, devoid of definition. I felt that these people were just fragments of my perception. We were all connected by something invisible that united our souls, but did not allow us to truly connect. I did not know whether I was seeking connection or trying to escape from it. Perhaps both. Every now and then, I stopped to look at myself. Mirrors, shop windows, even reflections in puddles. They were my only windows into my own mind. But those reflections didn't contain what I was looking for. before. I didn't see the person who had once been alive, filled with determination and purpose. I saw something else, someone who might have been me, but not who I once was. It was so alien that I could barely process that person as me. As strange as it may sound, I realized that this was my own illusion, my own version of reality, created in an attempt to maintain control. Everything I experienced was a lie, but on some level I couldn't help but believe it, because it was all I had. I felt like I had lost the ability to distinguish reality from my fantasies. I decided to move on without looking back. My footsteps became quieter, and the world around me became even more restless. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew that I couldn't stay in this place that I had created. My steps became uncertain, as if I were moving in an invisible space, not knowing what was hidden around the corner. I increasingly lost the sense of the physical world, as if all of reality was becoming nothing more than a projection, part of something that I had invented myself. Here, in this abandoned city, I felt for the first time how meaningless it was to me. The walls of the buildings, the asphalt that cracked under my feet, all of this was a useless background without any real weight. I didn't know what to look for in this place, but one thing was clear to me. I couldn't stay here without truly feeling my inner rupture. I couldn't continue walking these streets without breaking away from what was inside me. But when I looked back to leave again, I realized that I couldn't leave without an answer. I couldn't allow myself to stay in a place where the emptiness was growing so great that it was swallowing up everything around me with every step. I felt that perhaps the answers to my questions were hidden in this place, or in something else that I couldn't quite comprehend. I still couldn't believe that this emptiness was all that was left for me. I knew I couldn't ignore this internal process. I couldn't continue to live as I had before. I had to face it, without fear of what it would reveal. But what would happen next, and how would it change me? These questions still echoed in my head, but now I didn't know if I was ready to answer them. I woke up to a dull noise that ran through my veins, making my heart beat faster. But something about it was different than before. I couldn't pinpoint what exactly had triggered this internal alarm response, but I knew one thing. The sound was too familiar. It wasn't just noise, not just rattling in the walls or noises in distant rooms. It was something else, something that touched me, as if this world was tuned to the vibration of my consciousness. I sat in the darkness, where everything seemed strangely hazy. I wondered over and over again about what was happening. My mind caught in a maze of doubts. The clock, whose ticking I usually ignored, now seemed like a withering echo. It was carrying me along some strange parallel time stream that I could not control. I felt myself being pulled into the unknown by every moment, as if I was standing on the threshold of something that could either destroy me or set me free. But whatever it was, I did not know what it was. Then I stood up and went to the window. Because of it, the world seemed absolutely lifeless, like those moments when there is not a single person or movement outside. But here is what was strange. This world was even quieter than usual. Everything around seemed to freeze in its development. I saw the city, but it was somehow alien, and the further I looked, the less familiar it seemed to me. I stood by the window and thought about how strange this world felt to me now. It seemed empty, but at the same time powerful, full of something invisible, something significant that I couldn't understand. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong here. But what? The silence was becoming so heavy that I could almost feel it on me. It was like eavesdropping on something great, something that couldn't be solved, and there were no answers, only silence. My steps became slow and heavy, as if I were walking through some hidden space where every step weighed on me. It was like a journey into a dark abyss where there was no light, no sound. Everything around me seemed to dissolve into space, and I was part of this disintegration, part of something that no longer existed. I knew I couldn't move on, but despite that, I kept going. As I returned to my chair, I realized that there was no point in trying to find answers where there were none. I could no longer look to the world around me for explanations because I knew it was giving me nothing. The outside world had lost all meaning to me. My attempts to understand what was happening became futile, as if I were trying to outsmart myself. But with each step, I felt myself sinking deeper into my own consciousness, into a place where the answers were not on the surface. I continued to spin around myself, losing clarity. But perhaps in this vicious circle lay my answer. As time went on, I began to notice that I could no longer separate what was happening inside me from the outside world. I began to feel how my inner experiences were beginning to be reflected in what I saw. I couldn't help but notice how everything around me was no longer what it had been before. And it didn't matter whether it was the furniture in the room or the facades of the houses on the street, they began to turn into something more, into some kind of metaphor for what was happening inside me. The thoughts kept racing through my head. What if everything that was happening was actually a reflection of myself? If these were just my fears, made real so that I could face them, but then what was left of me, of the person I used to be? I could no longer separate the two worlds. They had merged into one, where everything was important and nothing mattered. When I moved away from the window again, I found that the night had become even stranger than before. The stars in the sky were dim, as if they had already begun to fade, like an eclipse. This corner of the sky could not help me, since it itself had become part of this world in which I found myself. I could not find meaning in it. I continued to move forward, but with each step, I felt myself dissolving more and more in this space. My own identity began to blur. There was no longer who I had been before, the persona I had lived and fought with. It was like I had become nothing more than a shadow, wandering in this alien world where I could not understand what I needed. Then I remembered that the world does not exist without perception. This meant that everything I saw, everything I felt, was my own creation. Perhaps I had long since stopped perceiving this world as it really was. Perhaps I had become part of my own madness without noticing it. This realization filled me with anxiety because I did not know how to get out of this circle. But I knew one thing. If I could not understand what was happening, then perhaps it was all meant to be this way. I stood in this room, and every moment of it pulled me deeper into the abyss of thought. This room was not just a place where decisions were made for me. It was the heart of the system that controlled everything. Our actions, our thoughts, our lives. Here we created, here we destroyed, here we decided who deserved to live and who did not. And now I found myself back here, among those who believed that everything we did was right. But what if I was wrong? I was surrounded by the same people, the same faces, the same looks, full of confidence and determination. They were looking at me, and I felt their attention on me. I was the chancellor. I was the figure who determined the direction of everything that happened in our world. But I lacked peace. When I wondered about what we had actually built, I could not shake the feeling that there was horror hidden within this ideal world. We had all locked ourselves in a cage. We had purged our world of the unsuitable, of those who did not fit into our new ideal. We thought that everything would be perfect with this world, that everything would be harmonious. But in this harmony, there was no room for real human existence. I had images of those we had cast out, or worse, destroyed. People who would not follow our path, who did not believe in the purity of what we were building. We called them the problem. And now that they were gone, the world seemed perfect, simple, clean, clear. But when I looked at its component parts, something was missing. Perhaps what gave the world flavor and meaning, the true human gift. We had destroyed that, striving for a perfection that could not be real. The projection on the wall in front of me continued to show a perfect world. Cities with elegant buildings, clean streets, green parks. In this world, there was no poverty, no chaos, no illness or disaster. Every place was ordered. Every decision was made with maximum efficiency in mind. But where was the soul of this world? Where were those who made this world come alive? Or was everyone just part of the system? As I looked at the painting, I thought about something that had been bothering me since I became chancellor, that everything we had created was devoid of humanity. We had sought purity, and in the pursuit of that purity, we had forgotten what made us alive. I wondered what we had lost by destroying everything that did not fit our ideals. We had wanted a better world, and perhaps we had achieved it. But what if that better world was not so good after all? What if we had simply done everything to avoid fear and had forgotten what made us truly human? My attention returned to the room. All these people sitting around the table seemed distant to me. Their eyes were cold, full of confidence. I knew they believed in what we were doing. They believed that getting rid of the unfit was the path to a better future. And I had once believed that too. But now I wasn't so sure. When I looked at the screen, I felt heavy. The projection showed cities, streets, workplaces, people who were happy in their gray, impersonal lives. I did not know how their lives could be happy. The system provided everything that was needed, but it left no room for self-expression, for a living soul. Everything was subject to one rule: order and cleanliness above all else. But what if this world wasn't perfect, but just a lie? What if we'd created a void that, despite all its outward signs of perfection, couldn't be filled with what makes us human? We were all connected by an invisible thread of fear of chaos, fear of things not being as perfect as we wanted them to be. We thought that if we cleansed the world of everyone who didn't fit our ideal, everything would be fine. But what if we were wrong? What if what we built was actually our prison? I saw the people gathered around me looking at the project and nodding approvingly. They did not ask questions. They did not see emptiness in this world. They believed that they had achieved something great. And perhaps I once thought so too. But now it seemed to me that this world in which everything was subject to rules, in which everything was planned out to the smallest detail, was not a world, but a construction, a machine in which there was no place for living beings. I turned to the others, but there was no spark in their eyes that could remind me that there was life in all this. There was none, only cold calculation. We had become part of a system, part of a soulless machine that processed everything in its path, leaving behind only empty shells of people, deprived of their uniqueness. I knew I couldn't stop this process. We had come too far, but deep down I began to understand. We had lost something important. We had built a world that had no place for real people, a world that was controlled but had no soul, no heart. And now all I could do was look at what we had created and hope that someday in the future, someone would realize that true perfection lies not in controlling, but in allowing people to be themselves. I left the room feeling like I was a stranger in my own world. I woke up with a strange sense of unease. Time seemed to have stopped, but everything around me continued to move in its usual rhythm. The clock on the wall showed the usual numbers, but something inside me felt different. Everything was not as before. I got out of bed and walked to the window as if in a trance. There was nothing new behind the glass. Ordinary buildings, gray streets, people hurrying about their business. But I felt something strange in their gazes, something that made me think again about what was happening around me. It wasn't that I had never seen these people before, but their faces looked different today. I couldn't figure out what exactly had changed. Maybe it was just my mood, I thought. Maybe it was just the effects of a sleepless night or overwork. But the feeling of emptiness in my chest was growing stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that this day was supposed to be important, that something was supposed to happen, but I didn't know what. I felt like everything I had built was starting to crumble, and yet I didn't want to admit it. I went to the shower trying to clear my head. Too often I let myself be consumed by doubt. Every now and then I doubted that we had done everything right. But the longer I stayed in this system, the less certain I was. It became increasingly difficult to justify actions that once seemed inevitable and right. After completing my morning ritual, I headed to my work. Every morning began the same way, with filling out reports, analyzing data, making decisions that seemed to determine the future of our society. I was chancellor, and in that position I was supposed to make decisions, no matter what they cost. In the room where we usually held meetings, there were already people waiting for the day to begin. I felt their eyes on me and immediately realized that something was wrong. The atmosphere was strange. No one spoke a word, not breaking the silence that seemed to fill the entire area. I picked up the folder with the papers, but I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts were slipping away again, going into vague doubts. The project we were working on seemed complete. It was perfect, at least on the surface. We all thought we were solving global problems, that we were creating a better world. And yet, every time I thought about it, I felt more and more uncomfortable. This project was almost finished, and maybe this was the moment when it should be finished forever. But what if this wasn't a solution? What if it was all just an illusion? I tried to get myself in the mood for work, but I kept being haunted by the thought, what if we were all wrong? We had spent so much time creating what we thought was the ideal, and now suddenly it felt like that ideal was just empty. I couldn't shake that thought. When the meeting began, I felt everyone watching me, but no one dared to break the silence. I took the floor, giving all the necessary instructions. It was a normal discussion, but it seemed to me that my words had become empty. I felt like these words were bouncing off me, not reaching my soul or mind. When the meeting ended, I was alone in the room, lost in my own thoughts. On the surface, everything was as usual. Work, reports, numbers, projects. But inside, I had a growing sense that we were all entering some kind of dangerous space. Everything we had created seemed surprisingly fragile. The system that had seemed perfect now looked like a mask, hiding something much darker. I kept working, but my mind was on something else. It wasn't just doubt, it was something deeper, a fear that we've lost touch with what really matters, what makes us human. The more I thought about it, the more I felt that I couldn't continue to be a part of this world. I couldn't just follow the rules without realizing that they were leading me to an unknown abyss. This world, this system, everything we so proudly called the future was not what it seemed. It was just an image of what we considered the ideal. We had created an empty world where people, instead of being alive, became part of a machine. I stood in a room that now felt cold and alien. This place that had once filled me with pride now felt like a prison. I knew I had to do something, but what? How could I destroy a system that had been so carefully constructed? And what would happen if I decided to destroy everything? I realized that I couldn't continue living in this world. Not the one we created, but this perfect but completely empty one. I had to find a way to return to humanity. But how? How to return to what we lost when we stopped being alive? My decision was ripe, and I knew that now I couldn't stop. Story 3. I woke up in the middle of the night from a strange sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then when I heard it again, I realized it was something more. A light scraping sound, like someone was tearing metal, came from the depths of the forest, and immediately a chill ran down my spine. The night was dark. Even the sky seemed to be swallowed up by this gloomy forest where I lived. My house was far away from everything. I had chosen this place for a reason: privacy, silence, and, it seemed, complete oblivion from the outside world. Harley, my dog, was always nearby, but at that moment I noticed that she was not lying at my feet as usual. I stood up and went to the window, trying to understand what was the source of this sound. The forest in front of the house was black as a threat. The trees seemed to lean toward my house, as if whispering something to each other. They did not move. I listened. All was quiet. Only the stars twinkled in the sky, in the dim light of which I could discern the silhouettes of the trees. There was always something strange about this forest. It might be beautiful, but it always seemed to have an invisible menace about it. I never felt safe here, even though I had lived here for years. Something was wrong with this place. Something old, sinister, that didn't want me to stay. I reached for the flashlight to better illuminate the area in front of the house, but suddenly I heard that sound again, the scraping. It was not coming from far away, but right next to the house, behind the fence. One thought struck me. It could have been one of the animals, just a strange movement in the night. But for some reason, I didn't want to check. I walked back to the window. There was no rustling, no footsteps, but something made me go out. I couldn't ignore that voice inside that was calling me. I threw on my jacket, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold air. Harley, my faithful dog, had finally followed me out, but she kept her distance, as if she sensed that I shouldn't go. In the darkness, I could barely see anything, just the faint outlines of trees and blurry shadows. I walked towards the sound. Every step I took was filled with uncertainty. Something about this place made me feel like my insides were clenching. But I kept going. I felt like I had to know something. This place was hiding something I needed to understand. The silence of the forest was frightening. Everything alive seemed to be holding its breath, watching me. I walked a little further and stopped. The grinding had stopped, but now it seemed to me that I sensed something else. It was not only in my ears, but in the atmosphere itself. Even the wind was silent, and the forest, despite its usual storm, froze for a moment. I peered into the dark branches of the trees, trying to see something unusual, and suddenly, in the dark corner of my vision, I noticed movement. It was something that could not be a normal animal. I can't describe exactly what I saw, but I felt a sense of terror grip me. It was black, almost blending into the dark background of the forest, and it moved with such grace that I would not have been able to see it if it had not risen into the air, like a ghost leaving the earth. Suddenly, I heard a soft bark. Harley. She was right behind me, but the sound was strange, scraping, almost inhuman. I turned around and only then realized that the dog was not where I had left her. My back tensed, and I felt a wave of cold run down my skin. Harley was gone. I began to rush about the forest, but she did not answer, did not appear. All I could do was search, despite the fear that overwhelmed me. Thoughts swirled in my head, but they were all lost in the foggy fear. I could not understand what was happening. I continued to call her, hoping that this was just some kind of game, but the answer was only silence. The further I went into the forest, the more I felt this fear intensify. Everything around me was shrinking, as if the forest was taking part in this strange performance. And then before me, there was emptiness, a platform on which there was nothing but the cold light of the moon that fell on the ground, illuminating the remains of gray bushes and dead trees. And in this light, I saw her. Harley stood still, but her eyes were different, dark as if they were absorbing the light, and there was something empty in her gaze. This was not my dog. I stopped, and something inside me told me that I should leave, but I couldn't take my eyes off her dark eyes. Something was drawing me to her. I was spellbound. But then suddenly Harley raised her head and barked. The bark was inhuman, grinding, deafening, and suddenly everything around went dark. I woke up on the ground, surrounded by cold, damp branches, as if someone had knocked me off my feet. It took me a few seconds to realize what had happened. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I stood up and looked around. The place I remembered as familiar was distorted. The forest I knew now looked completely alien, devoid of life. The sky was black, without stars, and the sky seemed to have shrunk, thickened. The air was thick, like darkness, and it seemed to be pressing down on me. My heart was beating fast, and I felt like every breath was an effort. I turned around. Harley was standing a few feet away from me, still motionless, but her eyes were not at all what I remembered. I approached her, but there was no joy or affection in her gaze, only emptiness. She stood like a statue, and despite her silence, I knew there was something unnatural about her behavior. I slowly reached my hand up to her head to stroke it, hoping that at least something would return to normal. But when my fingers touched her fur, I felt something hard and cold under her fur, as if there was something metallic hidden there. My fingers snapped back, and I pulled back, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Harley didn't react. She just stood there, rooted to the spot, her eyes still shining in the night. But now I knew it wasn't my dog. Something stirred inside me, a fear I couldn't explain, but one I'd felt in these woods for a long time. This place had always been strange, but now it felt threatening. I took a step back, preparing to leave, but something in my mind, some force, forced me to stay. Harley began to move. She didn't come toward me, didn't walk toward me, but something about her movements was frightening. She circled me slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. I opened my mouth to call out to her, but no words came out. The sounds that should have come out of my throat were stuck somewhere in my chest, as if they were being squeezed by an unknown force. Keeping my eyes on Harley, I felt the darkness of the forest pressing down on me again. Something was wrong here, but I couldn't figure out what it was. And suddenly, as if by magic, the forest came alive. Leaves rustled, branches creaked, and the air began to smell damp and decaying. I turned again and saw something emerge from the trees. It was a creature as big as a man, but it moved with such grace that I could not see it move. It seemed to blend into the shadows, blurring and disappearing into the dark corners of the forest. I felt a wave of terror run through me. This thing was part of the forest, part of the night, and I was just a wanderer lost in this nightmare. I started to retreat, but the ground under my feet suddenly rustled, and I stumbled. Time seemed to slow down, and I realized that I couldn't move away. I couldn't run away. This creature was approaching, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. I tried to get back to the house, but everything around me was unrecognizable. The forest was changing. The path I knew was gone, swallowed up by darkness. And here I stood, surrounded by this nightmare. Every tree, every bush seemed hostile. This forest was alive, it was breathing, and everything in it was trying to swallow me. I looked back at Harley. She was still motionless, her eyes now completely black, not blinking. I realized that if I didn't go, if I didn't leave this place, I would lose everything, Harley and my freedom. I turned and ran into the dark forest, unable to understand what was happening, but feeling that if I didn't run, I would be here forever. I ran, but despite the fact that the speed was crazy, it seemed like I was not moving at all. It seemed that no matter what I did, I was always pulled back. This forest, these shadows, everything that surrounded me did not let go. There was a feeling that someone was watching me, and I couldn't help but feel that it wasn't just a creature in the woods. It was something ancient, something that had seen people disappear, come and go, leaving only their traces. But not me. I felt myself losing strength. The forest was swallowing me up, and everything I knew about safety, about home, was gone. The only thing left was an attempt at salvation, but I was sure there was no way out of this forest. An invisible force squeezed me, and I realized that I would not be able to get out. I awoke in a dark room. The darkness was almost tangible, so thick that it seemed to envelop everything around me like a heavy blanket. At first, I didn't know where I was, but the feeling that I was not alone immediately overwhelmed me. The silence was alarming, such a silence that every rustle, every breath I took seemed louder than it actually was. I tried to stand up, but my body felt weak, like my muscles were made of cotton wool. It seemed like I hadn't moved in an eternity. I felt my hand briefly and felt the roughness of the wall next to me. It wasn't wood, not stone, but something strange that couldn't be identified. I froze, trying not to make any unnecessary movements, trying to feel what was happening. Dark shapes began to emerge from the corners, and I realized that I was in a room that I had definitely never seen before. It didn't look like my home or any familiar place. There were no familiar objects, no traces of reality. There were only a few objects casting long shadows, all in darkness. I reached into my pocket, searching for my phone to turn on at least a weak light, but all I felt was cold metal. A flash of despair shot through me when I realized that I had nothing with me. No familiar objects, no landmarks. I looked around again, And in that moment, I realized that something was wrong. The darkness wasn't ordinary darkness. It was alive. It seemed to be moving, agitated, piercing my consciousness, crawling into me. It felt like it was somehow coming to life, reacting to my presence. Every step I tried to take created this soft but inexorable hum, as if the very ground beneath me was shifting. Suddenly I heard a sound. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but in this space it sounded like a lightning strike. I froze. At that moment I realized that I was not alone in the room. In the corner, barely visible in the shadows, sat something. Its outlines were vague, but something in these contours made me feel afraid, as if I were looking at something that did not belong to this world. The creature didn't move. It was just there. In the shadows, its presence felt more powerful than the air itself. I tried to take a step back, but my legs felt like they were frozen. My whole body wouldn't obey me, and every glance I had was trying to escape from this horrible creature. I tried to concentrate, to understand what it was, but only my imagination painted even more terrifying pictures than those I saw. After a moment, it was closer, and I felt its gaze. It was heavy, filled with a crushing silence, as if every movement was slow time. I froze, unsure how to react. Perhaps if I hadn't moved, the creature wouldn't have noticed me, but every breath, every step became more difficult. And then it started moving, step by step, just like me, just like it was following me, copying my every move. I couldn't understand what was happening, but the feeling of being trapped was becoming unbearable. It was getting closer, and I knew that if I didn't get out, there would be no salvation. Despair filled my thoughts. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my chest. I tried to make my body move, but it was as if it was paralyzed. The creature was walking closer, its figure becoming clearer. I was almost sure that it was what I had seen in the forest, what was hiding among the trees, what was trying to follow me. Everything around me began to blur. The walls disappeared and I found myself back in the forest, but this time everything was even darker and more alien. The strange creature stood before me, but it was not alone. In its body, in its shadow, there were now other, smaller forms, just as dark and grotesque. I felt something pulling me into this chaos. It was like a whirlpool that didn't give me a chance to escape. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. I found myself in the same place again, but now there was no forest, no house, no road, no exit. The dark space swallowed me up. I woke up in the same place I had been before, but this time something was different. Now I knew for sure that this place wasn't just strange. It was alive, and it was watching me. It was as if I was the center of someone's attention, in a space that defied logic. My attempts to understand where I was and how I got here were fruitless. All I was left with was the feeling that I was trapped, in some kind of constant circle where everything was repeating itself, but each time with new, unknown shades of fear. The temperature in the room was cold, but I felt sweat trickling down my back as I made my way through the eerie darkness. This darkness wasn't just darkness. It was filled with the heavy breathing of something that had existed in this space long before me. I tried to press myself against the walls, hoping to find some kind of exit, or at least a landmark, but it was hopeless. The walls had no texture, no end. They seemed endless. Every step I took became more and more difficult. My body felt like it was enveloped in this terror, which grew stronger and stronger, soaking through me. I felt my breath catching in my throat, and panic began to take over my mind. It's hard to think logically in moments like these. All I knew was that I needed to get out. But how? I leaned against the wall, deciding to stop for a moment to collect my thoughts. In the darkness, like an echo, images began to appear, and this was even more frightening. They were not clear, but I felt their presence. Some shadows, something that hid in them, something that did not want me to stay alive. I could not understand exactly whether these images were really present or just a figment of my imagination, overwhelmed by fear. The same sound came again, soft but distinct, as if something had slipped across my path. I froze, trying to understand what was happening, but I didn't have to, because in that moment I felt it. The creature, it was close, very close. I could feel its presence, its gaze, even without seeing it in the darkness. It seemed to breathe down my neck, approaching my every move. Suddenly I realized this wasn't just a creature. This was something more terrifying. This was what had been haunting me from the very beginning. I tried to remember when I first noticed it. Maybe it was during that incident in the forest, or maybe the moment I discovered the strange spot on the ground that now continued to haunt me. Each time I tried to make sense of what was happening, it became clearer. I was part of something much bigger than just a strange story. I was part of its game, its plan. My heart began to beat faster. I knew he was watching me. He was standing somewhere in the darkness, knowing I could feel his presence. He was out of sight, but his shadow was everywhere. I could feel it stretching, elongating behind me, growing longer and angrier with each step. I didn't know what to do, but instinctively I began to move forward toward what seemed to be a passage. But step by step, I found myself in the same circle, in the same labyrinth. And no matter how I tried to move, I couldn't get anywhere. Everything was repeated, this darkness, this hopelessness. I realized that no matter where I went, I couldn't get out. I found myself in a loop, closed in on myself. A feeling of paralysis came over me. With each breath I took, it became harder to breathe, and the sounds I heard became more and more ominous. They were not just rustlings or whispers, but living sounds that seemed to come from the space itself. I began to realize the darkness and the creature were not random. They were part of this place, part of me, part of my fear. I tried not to think about it, but every effort only brought a new wave of fear. At some point, I realized that maybe I would never get out of here. Maybe this was all an illusion, or maybe I had already been dead for a long time. But at that moment, I felt something new. Somewhere ahead in the distance, in this endless labyrinth, I caught a faint light. It was a faint, almost imperceptible reflection, but it was there, and I knew that this was my only hope. I moved towards the light, ignoring the dark entities that seemed to be advancing behind me. With each step, the light grew brighter, and their shadows retreated, as if they were afraid of the light. With each step I took, I was getting closer to the light, but with each step I felt this dark substance, which seemed alive, pulling me back, like an invisible hand, clinging to my feet. The darkness I was leaving behind did not disappear. It seemed to follow me, filling every crack, every crevice in which a shadow could hide. But I kept going. Something in that light beckoned me, promising relief from this stifling, heavy darkness. I couldn't figure out what I was looking for. I didn't know that this light would bring me salvation, but moving forward was the only thing I could do. Each step became harder, but this faint light ahead gave me at least a little hope, at least a tiny assurance that I was not completely lost. When I finally got closer, the light was not what I had imagined. It was not a fire, not a lamp, not a stream of light, but something much stranger and more uncomfortable to perceive. It was cold, pure, as if it emanated from the void itself, and despite its brightness, it illuminated nothing in particular. I stood in the center of an ineffable radiance that enveloped me, giving neither a clear image nor clarity of what was happening. I felt the air around me become tense, as if something in the light was alive, but at the same time formless. I tried to step into this space, hoping that it would lead me to the exit, but I immediately realized that it was only an illusion. I was trapped in the light, surrounded by its coldness, like a cage in some universe without beginning or end. The darkness began to squeeze me even more tightly. I felt it trying to fill the space, to pull me back in, to engulf me. The sounds grew louder, as if reality itself was beginning to crack at the seams. With each passing moment, I felt it sucking the strength out of my body, my will weakening. It wasn't just fear, it was a feeling of utter helplessness, as if I was part of something I couldn't control, happening to me and around me. I tried to fight it, seemingly unaware that each attempt to resist only increased the pressure. And then I realized this was not just a place. This was not just darkness and light. This was nothing more than part of something far more terrible than I could have imagined. This was reality itself, shifting, elastic, subject to forces I could not resist. With each passing second, it became harder and harder to tell what was real and what was just my imagination. I tried to force myself to think of something, to latch onto a thought, an idea, something concrete that would remind me of who I was. But everything was slipping away. Everything was spreading out, blurring in this light and shadow. I stood there motionless, unsure of what to do. It felt like I was blocked, like this light had shrunk around me, making it impossible for me to move. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the feeling of emptiness that was taking over me was becoming unbearable. It was hard to breathe, and I was beginning to doubt that there was any real explanation for all this. Maybe I wasn't alive. Maybe I had been dead for a long time. Maybe this world was just a dream that I had gone too deep into and couldn't return to. The confusion grew as dark shapes began to emerge from the cold glow, barely visible but palpably present. I couldn't tell what these creatures were. Perhaps they were part of the light, perhaps they were projections, mirrors in this strange reality. But I knew one thing, they weren't friendly. They weren't simply part of the nature of this place. They were evil, and perhaps they knew I was trying to get out. I felt them begin to move toward me, as if I had been nothing more than an object of observation for them during this time. I was trapped. They were getting closer, and with each step, the dark figures became clearer. I could not understand what they meant, but their existence independent of me was so real that even the air seemed filled with their presence. My steps became panicked, but again and again I realized that I could not escape them. This world, this place, these creatures, they were part of something much more powerful. I began to understand that surviving here meant not just leaving this world, but somehow learning to be a part of it, learning to live in this dark reality that I had yet to understand. And no matter what lay ahead, I could not abandon this path. The dark figures began to move, and with each step they took, I felt them shrinking around me. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt their presence, something inhuman, cold, and utterly alien. They weren't just silhouettes, but something more sinister than any nightmare I'd ever encountered. With each step, their shadows grew longer, as if they were seeking a way into my reality, pulling me into their abyss. Instead of running or fighting back, I found myself paralyzed by this presence. I couldn't move, couldn't bring myself to take a step, as if they had somehow blocked not only my path, but my very ability to move. My body was bound by some invisible chain, and my heart was pounding wildly, tearing at my ribcage with each beat. As the creatures drew nearer, I heard a strange noise, like the rustling of leaves, but unnatural sounds were coming from within it, cracking sounds like bones breaking, cries I couldn't make out. I tried to figure out where they were coming from, but they were as changeable and absurdly multifaceted as this world itself. Everything around me began to lose its clarity, blurring into a murky substance that had no definite shape. And then I realized that with every step they took, I myself was beginning to dissolve into this obscurantism. My reality that I once knew was disappearing, leaving only an emptiness that these monsters filled. It wasn't just a feeling of fear, it was a feeling of your I disappearing, dissolving into an alien, hostile entity. The fear became heavy as concrete, and I tried to think of something to keep myself conscious, but it was like trying to hold sand in my hands. I had to move at least a little, or I would be completely lost in this abyss. At the moment when I jerked violently, trying to take at least a step, one of the dark figures, the one that was closest, stretched its shadow towards me. There was nothing human about it, nothing that could be called alive. It was an entity devoid of form, and this made its presence even more eerie. The speed of her approach increased, and I felt her shadow covering me. As it began to penetrate my soul, trying to cling to it, my consciousness cut this feeling like a blade, and I tried to retreat, but again found myself in this closed space where there was no movement, no escape. I stopped, gasping for breath, trying to figure out what was happening. Everything felt so real and unreal at the same time. Reality was unraveling around me, and these creatures, their shadows, they weren't just part of this world. They were part of me. They were like in my mind, in my body, and I didn't know how to fight it, how to push them away, how to find any way out of this trap where light and darkness intertwine and merge into an unimaginable tangle. And then, at the moment when I was already despairing, when my consciousness was almost completely consumed by this dark force, a new figure appeared before me. It was not like the others. It did not move. It simply stood, motionless, in the same light that had previously seemed so ominous. But this figure was not dangerous. On the contrary, it radiated a sense of peace, a sense of something familiar and inseparable, like that very part of my soul that had been searching all this time for a way to return home. And when I tried to take another step, even in her direction, the whole scene began to disappear. The darkness that surrounded me began to melt, like morning fog before the sun. The shadows dissolved, vanished, as if they had never existed. But I couldn't believe it. Something inside me screamed that I couldn't leave this world, that I couldn't go back to where I came from. But then, as if by magic, that cold light grew warmer, and the world began to take shape again. I didn't know what exactly had happened. Perhaps I had awakened. Perhaps I had thought I had been freed from the dark creatures. But whatever it was, I had sensed something important. I realized that despite all the abyss and horror that surrounded me, this light, this being, still held out a chance. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I was ready to move on. The world around me began to change. The creatures disappeared, as did the threat itself. The place where I found myself became clear and distinct, as if I were back in some familiar place. It was a space that I couldn't immediately comprehend, but I felt its rightness, and perhaps it was the only place where I could find my way. I moved on, not knowing what was waiting for me ahead, but I knew one thing: this shadow would no longer control me. The world around me seemed to lose its shape with every step. I moved through empty and lifeless spaces where even the shadows became part of the surrounding emptiness. With each breath, the air became heavier, as if it were squeezing my chest, and I felt my mind being consumed by this strange, unknown state with each passing moment. I didn't know how much time had passed, or if I could even go back. These strange creatures that were nearby had once scared me, but now they seemed part of me, part of everything I was experiencing. I stopped fighting this feeling and just followed it, not knowing what would happen next. It seemed like I was on the edge of reality in another world. Maybe it was a dream, Maybe it was something much more real and scary, but with each step I realized that I would not get out of this unless I decided what to do with what was around me. Suddenly, amidst the endless shadows and blurry images, I noticed something strange ahead. At first it was just a dim glow, but the closer I got, the more it took shape. It became bright, but not blindingly so, but somehow warm, like the light that radiates from the memory of home. It was a familiar light, a light I had once known, before the world around me became empty. I came closer and realized that this was not just a light. It was a door like from some long-forgotten memory. It was old, but there was nothing broken or flawed about its design. It stood in the void, like some strange window between worlds. I felt something inside me begin to move, as if this door was connected to something I was trying to understand and tear apart in myself. I stopped in front of it, not knowing what to do. Should I open it or stay here in this emptiness? I knew that behind it, perhaps, lurked the same darkness that I had already experienced. But on the other hand, this door beckoned me with its mystery, its light, which was so familiar that I could not ignore it. My body was constricted with an indescribable tension. I was faced with a choice: continue my journey in this strange world that seemed both alien and familiar to me at the same time, or try to enter the door and face what awaited me there. I reached out my hand. I didn't think about what to do next, but something inside me was pushing me to take this step. My hand, as if of its own free will, touched the cold surface of the door. I felt the space around me begin to change. The darkness began to dissipate, and the door began to glow brighter and brighter. The strange feeling of confusion receded, and I felt my mind returning, as if I was close to what I once knew and had lost. And so, when I felt that the force pulling me towards this door was becoming unbearable, I opened it. The world beyond was dark, but not as before. It was a place like an old library with tables and shelves filled with books. The light was dim, but not cold. It was a space that reminded me of home, but it also felt alien and incomplete. The shadows that had followed me before now dissolved in this place, and I could finally breathe freely. I stepped into this new space and the door closed behind me, leaving only silence. Story 4. Spring had finally arrived in New York City. Over the past week, the air had become filled with a sense of lightness, as if the city was just waking up after a long winter. I watched as people began to smile, their faces exposed to the cold. The streets filled with sounds that had been absent in the winter: laughter, the hum of conversation, and the quiet rustle of newspapers beginning to unfold on the steps of cafes. Dogs that had cowered in the cold for months were now happily pulling their owners forward, breathing heavily and with pleasure. Around me, the whole world seemed to be living a different life. I walked along the streets enjoying the contrast. The last time I went for a walk, it was the same. Only now, instead of the piercing wind and freezing rain, there were warm rays in the air, and the sky was clear, without a trace of clouds. It was spring, and I, like everyone else, felt it. I liked to watch how people changed at that moment. They became kinder, more open. It seemed that everyone began to appreciate what had previously seemed self-evident. After long months of gray days, I finally felt alive. I, like everyone else in this city, had been waiting for this moment when winter would finally give way to warmth. I decided that I would not waste a minute and take advantage of the opportunity to enjoy this moment to the fullest. I wanted the whole feeling of this new season to penetrate me until the very end. The sun, the air, the sounds, all this seemed an integral part of the new life, as if I myself were a part of this spring. Last night I thought it was worth celebrating. Nothing special, just meeting up with friends in a pub, having a few pints, and enjoying what the city gives me. I called up a few close friends who would always support such an idea and said we were meeting at the old place. We all knew that this gathering wasn't just a meeting of friends. It was a way to experience what it meant to be alive, to be part of a world that was changing so quickly around us. Pubs have always been my refuge. They were a place where I could relax, forget about all my worries, and most importantly, not think about what would happen tomorrow. In pubs, there was no need for difficult conversations. Everything was simple. You met people who understood you, drank beer, discussed insignificant things like yesterday's game or funny moments in life, and felt like a part of something big and important, even if in fact it was insignificant. All this talk and beer, noise and laughter, this was what made me feel that I was not alone in this world. As I walked down the street to the pub, I suddenly noticed how everything had become livelier. Tourists who had seemed confused and lost before were now confidently walking along the pavements, absorbed in their maps and conversations. It was as if the city had opened up to them anew. This was the spring they had been waiting for as much as I had. I walked down the street realizing that in moments like these, anything seems possible and the world around you becomes brighter. When I arrived at the pub, the atmosphere was the same as always. A few familiar faces, music in the background, the smell of fried food and beer. The place was the same as always, unremarkable, but there was something special about it that couldn't be found anywhere else. Behind the bar stood an old bartender who knew almost everyone who came in by name. I walked up to the bar, ordered a beer, and looked around, enjoying the moment. My friends and I often gathered here, and each time, although the places were the same and the conversations were similar, the feeling of time passing changed. Spring in New York did its thing. It made people look at the world differently. I felt that it was here, among these people and sounds, that I could take a break from the hustle and bustle and absorb this moment of fun. But the longer I sat, the more I realized that all this was just a short-term escape from reality. I had always known this, but today, when spring was at its peak, the feeling was more acute. All these days spent in beer and jokes distracted me from thoughts of what awaited me. My friends with whom I sat talked about all sorts of trivial things, discussed work, family, the next match. But inside me, there was a growing feeling that this was not just an evening to relax, but the moment when I had to start doing something important. I knew that with each passing day, I was losing something that I would hardly be able to get back. But spring allowed me to forget about it for a while, absorbing me with its light and warmth. I drank and reflected, watching these familiar faces become part of spring, smiling, laughing, happy that they no longer had to hide from the cold. Everything around me seemed to shift, and I became part of this spring, part of this life that pulsed through these people. The moment was perfect, and maybe that's why I wanted to linger in it longer. That evening at the pub seemed like just another relaxing time I was spending with my friends. But once I discovered this new perspective on everything that was happening around me, it became clear to me that there was more to these moments than just the ease of being. It was like a game in which my friends and I were both participants and observers. I felt like it was time to change something, to go further, maybe even to do something extraordinary. And this desire to change something was in the air, as was the smell of beer that permeated every corner of the bar. After a few drinks, I started thinking about the possibilities. I started thinking about that feeling I had as a child, when I was about to do something big and important, but I didn't know how it would end. I liked the idea that I could do something for myself, for my future, something that wasn't dependent on external circumstances or what others expected of me. I always believed that in such moments you need to be open to something new, and suddenly the thought came to mind that this was the moment when my next move would be decided. My friend who was sitting next to me noticed that I was thinking. He was always the kind of person who quickly realized when I was thinking about something, and sometimes his intuition was accurate, but this time, his attention only spurred my thoughts. I began to talk, although I was not sure that everything would work out as I had planned. It was more of an impulsive decision than a carefully thought-out step. I need to take a little time to sort something out, I said, not looking him in the eye, although I knew he was listening. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. I knew he was waiting for me to say something more specific. Instead, I decided to continue the discussion. You know, I've always believed that there's more to being with friends than just drinking beer and chatting, right? I continued, looking at the glass in my hands. Sometimes I think we could be a part of something bigger than just this. He paused. He had always been more pragmatic than I was, and now I could see that he was beginning to realize that I was serious. He certainly wasn't against having a fun evening, but this time something in his eyes told me that this conversation wasn't going to be as easy as all the others. I went on to explain that I needed something more, something that would make me feel in control of my life. You know, sometimes I think there should be more to life than just meeting up regularly and having a beer and all this talk about how well we live and how often we see each other. I said, becoming a little more serious. We can do more than just be good friends. Why not try taking on more responsibility? Try doing something that will lead us to something new. At this point, the conversation took a new turn. This was the moment when I finally opened my eyes to the fact that I needed to stop living only out of habit and start changing something. Although my friends did not seem to share my euphoria, I felt that at some point I had to take this step, a step towards more, a step towards something new. "Are you serious?" he asked, still reserved, but I sensed some surprise in his voice. "Yes," I replied, deciding not to evade the question any longer. "We can do it. I think we could come up with something that would not only change us, but maybe give us a way to move forward." He looked at me again. I didn't know what he was thinking, but it was clear that the idea I had put forward was not his usual one. He was a more calculating man, and perhaps my impulsive determination was difficult for him to understand. But despite this, I felt some understanding appear in his eyes. "You want to do something serious?" he asked, this time with interest. "Are you really sure this is what you want?" I nodded. Yes, I was sure. It wasn't just a wish. It was a feeling that grew inside me with each passing day. I was ready to step into the unknown, ready to change something, ready to accept the challenge. And it was in that moment, as I looked at him, that I knew that this conversation would become an important part of my life. We continued sitting in the pub, but the conversation had changed. We were no longer talking about simple things, but about how we could move forward, how we could truly change our lives. And although this conversation was far from over, I already knew that this moment had become a turning point. What I had just said was the beginning of something new, and whatever happened next, it was a step that could not be taken back. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, I woke up with the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just a new morning. It was the morning after something important, after I had made a decision. In that moment, sitting on the edge of my bed, I felt how everything around me seemed a little different. The questions I had asked myself in the pub now seemed more than just thoughts. They were a real challenge that I had set for myself. I had to do something more, something that would change my life. As I stood up, I felt the urgency to move forward, not in the sense of running, but in the sense of taking action. Last night, talking to friends, trying to find something more in our usual get-togethers, had made me think about how stuck I was in my comfort zone. But now that I had voiced my thoughts, I couldn't just let it go. I had to take action. I spent the day walking around the city, thinking about how best to implement my new approach. I thought about how important it is not only to leave behind old habits, but also to learn to see new possibilities. I spent the entire day searching for a solution, and my thoughts were not giving me peace. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that I couldn't just continue as I had been. Beer nights, talk of an easy life, none of that was quite what I was looking for. I needed something more. Yesterday's conversation with a friend showed me that if I really wanted to change my life, I needed to start small, with concrete steps, and not leave everything to chance. I decided that the first step would be something simple but important. I had to stop being afraid to take risks, and despite all the doubts, I knew I had to act. Later that evening, I returned to the same pub where it all started. The same people were there, the same faces, but now I didn't feel like I was part of the same old crowd. I wasn't the type of person who just drank a beer and waited for something to happen. I was ready for a change, and now I was determined to implement my ideas. I walked up to the bar, ordered a beer, but this time I wasn't focused on just relaxing. I looked at my friends again. They were all the same as before, but I couldn't stay in this bubble anymore. I began to realize that if I didn't take the first step, I would stay in this circle forever. I needed to break out, try something new. When I returned to the table, I did not speak right away. I simply sat down and was probably silent for too long. But when I did speak, my words were full of determination. I think we need something more than just another night at the bar, I said. I felt like it wasn't just an empty statement, but the beginning of what was to come. My friends fell silent. They waited for me to say more, but I didn't know what I would say either. This was something I had just realized. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't stop. I need to take more responsibility for my life. I don't want to depend on random encounters and casual evening get-togethers anymore. I want to take a step into the future. And if you want to be a part of that, I'm happy, but if not, I understand. It wasn't just a proposal, it was a promise to myself. I couldn't stay in the place where I was comfortable anymore. I knew this conversation was my first attempt at something new, something more. No matter how hard I tried to control myself, I felt a sense of excitement. It was scary, but also liberating. I was no longer the type of person who simply went with the flow. My friends started whispering among themselves. I knew they wouldn't all understand right away, but I was prepared for it. And while that night could have been another unremarkable night at the bar, it was the moment I decided I was going to take action. And with every word, every look, every decision I made, I felt like it was the first step toward what I really wanted: change. The next day I woke up with the thought that this wasn't just a nightly impulsive reaction, but a real decision that I had to make. But the more I thought about it, the more doubts crept into my head. It was natural. I knew that change is not easy. But at that point, I was too far away to give up, and at the same time, too close not to try. My mornings began with the usual rituals: a cup of coffee, a few minutes by the window. But this time, everything seemed a little different. My mind kept spinning about what I had said yesterday, about how important it is to move forward, even if you are not sure that the result will be as you imagine it. Yesterday evening was important, but it was only the beginning. Now I had to take responsibility for those words. I decided that the first step was not just telling myself that I would change something. I needed to start with concrete actions. Of course, I understood that this would not be an instant transformation, but if I did not start, everything would remain the same. Throughout the day, I went about my daily routine, but there was tension inside me. I still felt old habits pulling me back. Coffee at lunch, casual conversations with colleagues, viewing my life as static and predictable. It wasn't bad, but I knew that if I didn't take a step, I'd be back in the same place in a month, a year, or even 10 years. This constant routine was missing something important that I could call my own. I thought of my friend who told me so easily yesterday that he always pays off his debts and doesn't worry about money. He was more self-confident than me. He just lived without thinking about the consequences. And that was probably one of the reasons why our conversations often led to dead ends. He always put me in a situation where I started to doubt myself, but now I realize that I need to find my confidence. By evening, I had gathered my strength and went to the bar. When I entered, I was greeted by the familiar atmosphere. Cheerful conversations, laughter, the smell of beer in the air. I still felt the tension, but this was the moment when I had to confirm my intentions. I couldn't just sit and wait for something to change. I had to act. I walked up to the bar and ordered a glass of beer, but this time I wasn't going to stay in my corner. I was going to talk to people, be more open, stop hiding behind the walls I knew. When I got back to my table, I realized what I needed to do. This was the moment I could actually start being honest with myself. I had to overcome my doubts, my fears that were preventing me from moving forward. And although there were still many buts in my head, in reality, I knew that only actions can lead to changes. I started talking to friends about my plans, about how I wanted to not just waste time, but to actually do something worthwhile. With each conversation, I became more and more aware of how much my doubts were influencing my decisions. I wasn't ready to completely break old habits, but I knew I had to start with small steps. That conversation in the bar, those words I said, and the way they resonated with me, that was my overcoming. When I returned home, I felt that inner gap again. Even though I had taken the first step, the fears inside me were still there. It was that moment when I had to decide whether to continue to fight the doubts or to accept them and move on. I thought about my friend who had always been confident in himself, and it became clear to me that confidence does not come by itself. It is built through actions, even if they are small and not always perfect. With this thought, I went to bed. The morning began with determination. I knew that I had to work on myself to overcome this internal conflict. Doubts were an inevitable part of the journey, but they could not stop me. Every step forward, despite them, was important. Over the past week, I began to feel a change in the air. Everything in the city became so light, as if a moment had come when all the tension and fatigue were gone, and ahead was only a clear and warm future. New York was filled with light. Its streets were full of people who could finally open up under the bright spring sun. People were smiling at each other. Dogs were not shivering, but simply walking calmly, enjoying the temperature. It was indescribable, as if nature itself was reminding me that the time for rest and renewal had come. But at the same time, these moments of happiness always accompany me with a slight feeling of anxiety. Anxiety that this spring, like the previous ones, can pass me by, leaving nothing but short encounters with joy. And so yesterday evening, I found myself again at the local pub with friends. We hadn't seen each other for a couple of weeks, and it felt like the perfect time to spend the evening having a good chat and a few pints of beer. It had become something of a tradition, allowing me to break out of the routine and feel alive. We laughed, discussed silly things, and the world seemed so simple and understandable. Maybe it was the few beers that seemed to ease the tension in my body and mind. I was in my element when conversations with friends turned into something deeper than just sharing funny stories. After a few pints, thoughts began to smoothly move on to more important matters. I began to feel that there was something more missing in my life. It felt like it was time to move forward, to seek new horizons, and not just waste days on evenings in pubs. Spring gave me new hopes, but something in these hopes was still empty. I could not forget that my life, despite its stormy dynamism, was like an empty cage. A lot of noise, but little meaning. As I stood up to get another beer, one of my friends who worked in construction asked me to grab one for him too. We always did it this way. One person would pay for everyone, and the other would return the gesture when the situation allowed. It felt right, but in that moment, something changed. He offered to let me not pay, just get him a beer, and I agreed. He was my friend, and I trusted him, but something inside me had flipped, and I suddenly felt a little used. Like this simple gesture was something more. It wasn't just a request, but a signal of sorts. A signal that relationships with friends might not be as genuine as I thought. I went to the bar, but on the way there, I started thinking that there were a couple of difficult moments in my life that needed to be addressed. Why did this little incident with beer affect me so much? Why did I start feeling like my whole life was like a little business deal where you always owe someone something and they never give you anything back? I took the drinks, went back to my friends, but my head was already spinning with completely different thoughts. We continued drinking, but the conversation became a little tense. I couldn't get the beer scene out of my head. What if I was just wasting my time? What if my relationships with my friends were just an exchange of favors, where everyone expected something in return? This all led me to question my life in general. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't living for myself, but constantly playing roles that were forced upon me. I watched my friends get what they wanted easily, but I felt like I was always in debt to someone. It wasn't just about buying beer or doing favors. It was about everything. My friends' words about IOUs in this atmosphere of mutual obligation only reinforced this feeling. Suddenly, it became clear that I wasn't just going through life, but rather making deals, where every step was a debt, not a real choice. By the time I got home, I was consumed by these thoughts. My brain was overloaded with thoughts about what I was doing with my life, what relationships surrounded me, and why it was all so complicated. I couldn't just go back to my old life and pretend everything was okay. I needed to change something. I realized that all these beer nights were just an attempt to escape reality, not a way to change anything. Everything around me was filled with mutual expectations and obligations. But where were my personal decisions? I went to bed with this heavy feeling, knowing that the morning would bring new opportunities for reflection. All I could do was think about how I could step forward and not get stuck in this endless cycle of expectations and obligations. The sun rose again, and I knew I would have to decide on something. Day 6, and I can feel the tension fading. This was the day I decided to do something big, even though I didn't yet realize how big it would be for me. I started my journey by feeling like my body was ready for a change. It wasn't a big milestone, but I suddenly realized that I needed to take the first step in the direction of change. This day was like a breath of fresh air, like the moment when life suddenly falls into place and you start to see perspective. Things that seemed small now became significant, as if I suddenly began to understand that my future depended on how I approached each step. I got out of bed earlier than usual, as if something was pushing me. I knew that I couldn't waste any more time. Spring continued to give its energy, and every ray of sunshine made me think about how important it was to take advantage of this moment. I went to a cafe to just drink a cup of coffee and spend time alone with myself. It was important to meet myself in silence. With each sip, I felt how the barriers I had put up for myself, the fears and doubts that I couldn't change my life, were gradually breaking down. I always thought that I needed something amazing to take a step forward, but at that moment I realized that everything is much simpler. All I needed was a decision to start. After the cafe, I went to the park where I usually spent time, but today this place seemed different to me. The sunlight was shining through the trees, and I suddenly realized that I hadn't noticed the beauty of these simple things for a long time. It seemed like I had been in this place hundreds of times, but now it looked like something new. I went there just to sit, feel the earth under my nails, listen to myself, and that was exactly what I needed to do. I sat there watching people, how they interacted with the world around them, and I realized that they too were searching for something. Everyone who passed by seemed to be moving, searching for something they themselves could not yet name. Sometimes they stopped to appreciate the moment, sometimes they ran, hurried, rushed, but they were all searching for meaning, just like me. This was the moment when I realized that I had to stop avoiding change. I had to embrace it, and not just embrace it, but actively create my own reality where I would be a free person. I could no longer live in the shadow of my fears and doubts, no longer be someone who just watches life, but become someone who lives it on my own terms. This was my chance, and I couldn't miss it. As I walked through the park, I felt all my doubts begin to dissolve. I knew there would be challenges along the way, but I also knew they wouldn't have power over me if I was ready for them. It wasn't a decision made in a second, but rather a realization that I was ready to move forward, ready for change. Even if I didn't know what it would be, I was ready to start a new path. Coming home was the first step on this path. It wasn't just a return to my familiar surroundings. It was the moment when I realized that even in the most ordinary places, something extraordinary could be found. I could feel differently, I could think differently, and although I didn't yet know where exactly this new path would lead me, I felt that at that very moment, something important in my life had changed. I walked into my apartment and felt every object around me look new. Even the walls seemed to be part of my new path. I knew that I would now be doing, not just existing. It was like a revelation that I could be the one who controls my own life and not wait for it to change itself. This moment was significant, not because I achieved something, but because I finally realized that I can achieve anything I want if I keep moving forward, despite all the obstacles. From that day on, I began to rebuild my life. All I needed was to take the first step, and now I was ready to take them every day. Day 7. I woke up early, as usual, but now every morning became something more for me. I felt this new state inside me growing stronger, as if the internal compass that had been broken for a long time was finally showing the right direction. I looked out the window and everything seemed so clear. Not a cloud on the horizon, not a shadow of doubt. I knew that today was an important step for me, and although it was just another day in my life, I felt that it was filled with some special meaning. Breakfast was the same as always, a cup of coffee and some toast. But even in these small things, I noticed a change. I ate slowly, thinking about what I could do with this day, what decisions I had to make, what steps lay ahead. This was not just a morning when you prepare for an ordinary day. This was a morning when you no longer just observe the world, but actively become a part of it. In that moment, I realized that every day is a chance to change my life, and now I wanted to take advantage of it. After breakfast, I was about to go out and walk around the area that had been familiar to me for so long, but now looked completely different. I realized that in recent years, I had become something of an observer. I see life around me, but I seemed to remain on the sidelines. Now everything had changed. I was ready to enter this flow, this movement. Step by step, I began to do what had previously seemed impossible. I decided to act. Just like that, without further ado, just step by step. Every morning was like an empty canvas, and now I felt that the time had come to fill it. Along the way, I noticed how everything around me had changed. The same houses, the same trees, the same people. But everything seemed new, as if I had suddenly begun to notice details that had previously escaped my attention. I smiled. It was simple. To start looking at the world differently, to start seeing things that had previously seemed unimportant. Even the old familiar cafe on the corner seemed somehow bright, somehow alive. I realized that it was these small moments that added up to something greater, that every moment could be used to feel alive. I continued on my way, but I was no longer the person who simply walks along a familiar road. I felt how every street, every step was filled with meaning. Every place that had previously seemed part of my daily routine was now full of life. And suddenly an idea came to me. What if I could create something new in my life? It didn't have to be something global. It didn't necessarily have to become an event that everyone would talk about. But I realized that every step forward was already an achievement. Suddenly it occurred to me that I could reach out to those I hadn't spoken to in a long time. I realized that all this time I had been distancing myself from people, from communication, from life. It hadn't been a conscious decision, but now I saw that it hadn't led me to what I wanted. The time had come. I needed to bring myself back into this world. Returning was part of the new path I was starting. It wasn't supposed to be easy, but now I cared. I went to the park where I hadn't been for a long time. Walking in the park always gave me a sense of peace, a place where everything happened slowly, unhurriedly. I sat on a bench and the world around me continued to exist as before. People passed by, children ran on the lawn. Someone read a book on a bench. This was the very place where I could distract myself from everything that was troubling me. But now sitting here, I felt not only peace, but also confidence. I realized that this place could now become a part of my path. I could return here again and again, and each time find something new. The solution became obvious. I had to start working with what I had. I couldn't keep looking for the perfect conditions or waiting for the situation to become more conducive to change. I had to start right now with what I had. I returned home with a clear thought: act. At that moment, I realized that my whole life depended on how I would perceive every detail, every decision, every step. I decided to spend the next day working on projects I had been putting off for a long time. Instead of just complaining about the situation, I decided to take responsibility and start moving forward. I couldn't afford to wait any longer. Inside me, there was a burning desire to change something, to make each day bring me not just happiness, but meaning. As soon as I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, it became clear to me that right now was the most important step for me, to start doing what I had been putting off. These projects weren't difficult, but constantly putting them off ate up my time, my energy. With each step, I felt the weight lift as I regained control over my life. The day flew by, and by evening I felt incredibly satisfied. I knew it was just the beginning, but I was already sure that I had chosen the right path. Time does not stand still, and I realized that it was up to me how it would go. There was no need to wait for the right moment or ideal conditions. All I needed was to act, and I began to act. Now, in the evenings when I went to bed, I felt how the silence around me became not frightening, but calming. I stopped being afraid of the unknown, stopped being afraid of what awaited me. I realized that it is not what happens that matters, but how you perceive it. And every day now was like a new opportunity, a new step towards the changes that I had always sought, but never dared to make. Story 5. We were heading west. That was our destination, and there was no turning back. Sometimes at night, by the light of the fire, I thought about how the roads and villages we had once left behind were far behind. Ahead was only the wide world, full of unknown spaces. We moved slowly, confident that our road was still long, and there was so much unknown ahead. The wind was light and the sky cloudless, as if the world had stopped for a moment to allow us to enjoy a moment of peace before a new day. The night was already approaching its zenith when we found a convenient place to spend the night. We stopped by a river. It was not just a river, it was wide and calm, like a giant mirror surface, reflecting everything around it. The river flowed slowly, and it seemed to me that it could carry away everything that fell into its waters without much effort. The water was clear, and in its depths, if you looked closely, you could see moss-covered stones and rare seaweed that danced in its depths, like ancient spirits hiding from view. We quickly built a fire and, feeling the warmth of the fire, began to cook dinner. The fish was fresh and the smell of it frying on the coals filled the air. We sat around the fire, each absorbed in our own thoughts, but still sharing this quiet night. There was a special feeling of safety around the fire, as if nothing and no one could disturb this moment of peace. We did not say much, but it was clear that each of us understood that we were here for a reason. We needed to move on, but we stopped to take a breather and prepare for a new day. I was crouched there watching the play of fire when I suddenly felt something change in the air. It wasn't any obvious threat or danger, but rather a sense that there was something unusual around us. I looked up at my companions. I saw one of them, Darius, looking thoughtfully at the river, his eyes focused, his face showing neither surprise nor fear. It was as if he already knew what was coming. Then his voice broke the silence, though it was not loud. He simply said, "I bet you 3 that I can bring a stone that can cross this river." I glanced sideways at the river. The water was calm, almost still, and for a moment I thought it would be easy to cross if I could find a suitable rock. But I knew there was a challenge in Darius's every word, not just a game. He was confident in his ability to do this. We all looked at each other, a little puzzled, but as if it was inevitable. Everything around seemed too calm to be taken as simple entertainment. I felt that here in nature, everything was connected. Water, fire, air, and earth. All these elements lived here, under our nails, in our breath, and in our gaze. Darius proposed a bet, and we accepted. It was almost like an ancient game, where everyone tests each other for strength, where everyone had to use their strength to win. I looked at the fire. Fire, this ancient and powerful element, was both our ally and our enemy. It could warm us on a cold night, but it could also consume everything if left unchecked. A thought flashed through my mind. What if Darius decided to use it? I wondered what kind of stone he would bring, but I knew he would be full of confidence, as if everything had already been decided. Our entire squad was like that, believing in their own strength, but sometimes that strength did not come true, and then the unexpected came. Everyone began to disperse, and I was in no hurry to go look for my stone. Instead, I sat by the fire, watching the stars that were beginning to appear in the dark sky. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the threshold of something important. This wasn't just a journey. This was a test that we were all meant to go through. Each of us, no matter how hard we tried to hide it, felt like we weren't alone. The minutes dragged on. I saw Darius return with the stone in his hands. He was sure that his plan would work. His eyes were shining, and his hands were holding the stone tightly. It was not just any stone, but something special. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but there was a strange, sincere determination in his eyes. He walked up to the river and, without hesitation, threw the stone into the water. We all froze. The stone met the surface of the water, and at that very moment, an unexpected moment occurred. The stone crumbled into dust, and the ashes dissolved in the water. We stood there, unable to understand what had just happened. Darius, dumbfounded, returned to us, his face slightly pale, and his eyes filled with bewilderment. Could the fire have made a mistake? Flashed through my mind. We were all silent around the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else hidden in this world. This was more than just a bet. This was a moment when each of us had to look within ourselves, understand our limitations, and realize that the world around us was far more complex than we could ever imagine. Wynn was the first to offer his answer to the challenge. When Darius returned to the fire, his face was hidden behind a shadow of disappointment. He was shocked that the fire had failed to cope with his task, and although he tried to hide his disappointment, his eyes were full of confusion. We were all silent, experiencing a moment of failure, until Lucen, the second traveler from our company, broke the silence. Lucen was a person whose self-confidence was unquestionable, and we all knew that she would not miss the chance to test her strength. I saw her stand up, her face full of determination. When she came to the river, I expected her to look for a stone, like Darius, but she turned to us, almost smiling, and said, "The fire couldn't cope. Now it's my turn. I know that the wind has power, and it must help me pass this river. With that, she headed toward a high hill that rose not far from us. We watched her climb toward the top, where there was a sparse forest through which strong winds sometimes broke. Lucine was familiar with this place, and it seemed to me that she knew where to look. I sat by the fire and watched her silhouette disappear into the darkness. At that moment, I wondered what exactly she was planning to do. I had no doubt that she believed in her victory, but I also couldn't help but wonder what was behind her desire to win. Lucine had always been confident in herself, and it seemed that she never doubted her abilities. We sat in silence, and only the crackling of the fire broke the silence when, after a while, Lucine returned. In her hands she held a stone. It was a light, almost ethereal stone that sparkled as if it had been carved from the air itself. It was so light that it seemed almost weightless. Lucine walked to the river and, without thinking, threw the stone into the water. The stone did not fall into the river. It rose sharply and at the same moment, obeying a strong gust of wind, flew into the air. We all froze. The stone seemed not to want to stay in place, and its careless flight in the sky was as if the elements themselves were taking part in this test. Lucine smiled, her face lighting up with inner satisfaction. But then the stone, strangely enough, spun and flew away without touching the water. It disappeared over the horizon, carried by the force of the wind. We were all silent, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Lucine stood there, and her face expressed something more than simple surprise. It was regret. "He's gone," she said, shaking her head. "The wind is too free. Its power will not be so constrained." None of us could answer. We all looked at the river, at the place where the stone had disappeared. I thought that something more had to happen, that the wind could help to cross the river, but at some point I realized that the solution to this problem would not be as simple as we expected. Lucine returned to the fire, and we gathered again in silence. I tried to process what was happening. We had all experienced something important, and though we each brought something unique to the test, none of the stones could defeat the river. I felt the silence of the night become an even deeper reflection of our failed test. We already knew that the next step would be even more difficult. Tomorrow was our time. We had to move on despite the setbacks because we were searching for something that could not be explained. We could not stop so easily. The next day we had to accept a new task, although I already knew that it would be difficult and full of unknown dangers. I looked at the river again and felt how its calm surface hid much more than just water. It was something we couldn't control. We were trying to find a rock that could cross the river, but in reality we weren't looking for a rock. We were looking for something much bigger, something that couldn't be easily found. We were trying to understand the nature of the world, but that world kept eluding us. The next morning we woke early, as usual, but the silence that hung in the air felt especially heavy. Our failures with the stones, the first fire, the second air, left us in a state of uncertainty. We did not know what would happen next, but each of us knew that the game was not over. We moved to the river to continue the test, but this time, our third companion, Thorn, was the first to rise. Thorn was a man who had always been drawn to the wisdom of nature. His gaze seemed to see further than what the world showed him. He was someone who always looked for answers in ancient stories and legends. He didn't say much today, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't explain. He understood that there were no accidents in this world, and that the river that was unstoppable to fire and air would also be unstoppable to simple stones. He walked toward the river, his face taking on a concentrated expression as he looked up at the sky and seemed to listen to the ground beneath his feet. We watched him with interest, but no one intervened. We knew Thorn had already found a solution, although it would likely not be so obvious. When he finally headed for the hills, we had no choice but to watch his movements. Thorn was always mysterious, and his decisions were not always clear to us, but he could speak to the world like no one else. I never saw him in a hurry. He always moved as if time were just an empty space for him to control. When he returned, he had a stone in his hands. It was a stone we had not expected. Not bright, not light, not beautiful. It was a heavy stone, brown, rough, and seemed to be covered with deep cracks that spoke of time and the power of the earth. This stone was heavy and dense like the earth itself, and despite its inconspicuousness, it was clear that it did not obey simple laws. Thorn walked to the river and looked at us. We were silent, looking at his stone. I could feel his hands holding it with respect, as if he knew it was more than just a stone. He turned toward the water and threw the stone. When it had traveled a few yards, it hit the surface with a loud thud and was swallowed up. The stone did not disappear. It did not dissolve into the water like Darius's stone, or fly into the air like Lucine's. It remained where it was, swallowed up by the river as if it had claimed it as its own. We were all silent, looking at the scene. The stone stood in the water, but it was not carried away by the current. It did not sink, it did not slide. It was as if it were part of the river itself. It was an integral part of it, as if the water recognized in it its own power. Time seemed to stand still, and we all understood that this was a stone of the earth, which could not be shaken by the elements, because it was itself part of the world that created all other forces. When Thorn came back, his face was calm, but there was a confidence in his eyes that had not been there in our previous attempts. He knew that we had all seen something important. This was not just a stone, it was a manifestation of the power that was in the earth, in the world itself. The earth does not give in to the momentary gusts of fire or wind. It remains unchanged, and that is its strength. It is not always what we expect, Thorn said quietly, looking at us. The stone of earth could not fly like the stone of wind, nor could it dissolve like the stone of fire. But it was what this river needed. We seek answers in obvious powers, but often they are hidden in simplicity and time. I stood there listening intently to his words. Everything seemed clear, but at the same time, many questions remained. How could this stone stand up to the waters when others could not? Why was this stone the one that defeated the elements? But Thorn was right. Sometimes you don't need to look for complex solutions. Sometimes you just need to listen to the earth. We all returned to the fire, and I sensed that this night would be special. There was something heavy and calm in the air. We were on the brink of something greater, and I knew that this test was not just a test of the strength of the elements, but also our ability to understand what lay beyond the visible. The river that we could not cross with fire, wind, or simple stone was now conquered by something that had long been forgotten. The stone of the earth, which quietly but surely joined its nature. We all understood that every challenge requires its own answer, and sometimes to overcome difficulties, you just need to understand the essence of what you are dealing with. We continued on our way. There was still another mystery ahead, but now we knew we had the keys to solve it. We were closer to the truth than ever. With each step we took, the river's hum grew louder, as if the river itself were preparing to welcome us into its waters. We walked in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Thorn looked calm, his gaze focused on the distant horizon, and I could have sworn that there was no longer any doubt in his soul. But I knew this wasn't the end of the ordeal. We all knew that until one of us conquered the river, we would not be completely free. This was the moment of truth, the moment when everything we had been trying to understand would become clear. How would we continue our journey if we didn't overcome this final barrier? Evening came, and we decided to set up camp right by the river. The water flowed gently, wrapping around the rocks and swaying the grasses on the banks. It was beautiful, but there was something tense about this piece, as if the river itself held a secret that could only be revealed to those who were ready to understand it. I sat by the fire lighting the flames, unsure of how to approach the next step. But then I saw her. The sister who had been with us from the beginning stood looking out at the water. Her face was tense, but in her eyes I saw something I couldn't explain. She wasn't asking us, wasn't looking for permission. She was ready to take a step forward. She took the first step toward the river, and when her foot touched the water, the river didn't push her away, didn't carry her away. Instead, it seemed to embrace her, and I felt a gentle wave wash over her feet. We were all silent. We knew her moment had come. It was her turn. My sister came closer to the water, but instead of throwing a rock like the others, she simply knelt down at the river's edge. I watched her hands glide over the surface of the water, touching it with respect, as if she were talking to the element. The river was accepting her. The water in her hands was not the same as it had been during our previous attempts. It was not aggressive, not trying to resist. On the contrary, the water seemed to welcome her touch. My sister held up a small stone, no bigger than my palm, but perfectly round, as if the river itself had sculpted it. She looked at it carefully and said softly, "This is a water stone." I couldn't understand what she meant, but it seemed important. She brought it to her lips, touched it gently, and in that moment the stone became more than just a stone. It took on a shine, and its surface seemed to become alive, tangible. I saw how the water did not resist him, but accepted him. It was as if he had dissolved into its current, but did not disappear. The stone moved through the water as if it were part of its very existence. It did not fall into it, was not absorbed, but moved as if it were an extension of it. It did not slide, did not try to fight the current, but seemed to float with it, maintaining balance. The river did not swallow him. It did not resist. It accepted him as an equal. It was more than just submission to the power of the water. It was a a symbol of mutual understanding. The river and the stone became one, and when the stone reached the opposite bank, it did not disappear. It remained there as if it had left a mark in the river. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. We were all silent. We all understood that this was a stone of water, a stone that could not only cross the river, but also become part of it. It was the moment when everything fell into place. We all knew that victory was not in overcoming the elements, but in understanding them and becoming part of them. The stone of water became a symbol of this understanding. Sister stood up, her eyes shining, but she said nothing. She didn't need words. We all knew she had won, not because she had conquered the river, but because she had found a way to be in harmony with it. She had accepted the river, and the river had accepted her. This was not just a test, but a lesson we all needed to learn. When we returned to the fire, I felt that there were no more boundaries in the world. Water, earth, fire, and air. All these elements were not enemies, but parts of one whole. We had not defeated the elements. We had learned to understand them. We had learned to live in peace with them. And now each of us carried a part of that lesson with us. My sister looked at us and said quietly, "To cross the river, you have to become part of it." And we all knew she was right. We knew that was the only way to win. That was how our encounter with the river ended, but it left a mark on our hearts. Each of us now understood that the path does not always lie through struggle. Sometimes you just need to be in harmony with what surrounds you. We continued walking, now with a new awareness of how important each element of our path was. We crossed the river, becoming part of it, and left a trail in the water. But ahead of us was fire, the element we had failed to control earlier when we tried to throw a stone of fire. Thorn had always been the one who understood more deeply than anyone else. He watched each of us, and I noticed his gaze became more wary. He sensed that our trials were not over, that there was one last wall to overcome. We had arrived on a desert plain, and even the air here was hot, almost like a fire that pulsed invisibly in the earth. I stood there feeling the heat on my skin, as if the earth itself had begun to burn our feet. We felt the fire already around us, quiet, hidden, waiting for us to stop being careful. We moved slowly as if we knew that, for all its power, the fire was not the worst thing. We had survived the wind, the earth, the river, but now the most ominous elements awaited us. Thorn took his time. He scanned the ground beneath his feet again, studying the soil carefully, as if searching for something hidden. We didn't speak, but everything inside me told me that this time would be different. We were ready. We had changed. Thorn stopped again and bent down to the ground, removing a small piece of stone from his belt. It was like the ones we had used before, but it was different. It had a different kind of power, a different way of working. He held it to the fire, and with the first touch, the stone began to glow faintly. It was not a fiery flame, but something deeper, subtler, hidden. "It's not just fire," he said, his voice quiet but confident. "Fire is energy, it's life, but to control it, you have to understand how it works." I couldn't immediately understand what he was talking about, but when Thorn placed the stone back on the ground, its surface changed. It began to harden and expand, as if the stone itself were burning, leaving no ash. It wasn't fire as we knew it. It was a force that connected us to fire, not destroying us, but rather purifying us. Thorn took the stone in his hands and held it out to me. I felt how its temperature was unbearably high, but the stone did not burn me. It was hot, but there was a harmony in it, a power. It was a fire that was in us, not around us. It was not an external enemy, but a force that burned but did not destroy. I picked up the stone, and it was as if I was holding fire in my hands, but I wasn't afraid of it. In that moment, I realized that fire was not an enemy. It was an energy that could be mastered, that could be learned to use if you were attentive and patient. We were all silent until I placed the stone in the center of our camp. It was like a spark in the night, bright and warm, but not destructive. It was a force we could use. The firestone was not just fire, but a symbol of our willingness to become part of this element, to understand it and learn to control it. When I looked at all of us, I felt that we had become different. We were no longer just travelers, looking for a way to get through trials. We were those who understood the nature of the world, who were able to find harmony with each element. We found the fire within ourselves. With every step, with every trial, we became stronger. We learned not to defeat the elements, but to become a part of them, to understand their nature and use their power for our own purposes. As we sat around the fire, I looked at the fire that burned before us. It was bright and alive, but we knew now that its fire was not an enemy. We had become part of this force, and now it worked for us, not against us. At that moment, I realized that we had come not just to trials, but to a deep knowledge of the world that was around us. We had been through fire, but it did not destroy us. It taught us how to use its power, and now we knew that there were many more difficult paths ahead, but we were ready. We became stronger, and every element we faced made us those who could change the world. We continued on our way, knowing that fire was not just an element to be conquered, it was a part of us, and we knew how to handle it now. There were still many challenges ahead, but we were ready to face them, because we were now part of a force we had never understood before. Morning came quietly and unexpectedly, like everything we could expect from the wind. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. Gentle gusts left no trace, but their presence was felt in every movement, in every shadow. We stood on a high hill overlooking a vast plain where the wind could roam freely. It was there, but it was not visible. It moved the world, but we could not say exactly where it came from. It was an element with which we had yet to learn to work. As Thorn approached the edge of the hill and looked at us, I saw a strange determination in his eyes. He knew that this would be no simple test, but a real battle with the invisible. We had faced fire, earth, and water before, but the wind was more than that. The wind was uncontrollable. It was fickle, unstable, and could slip away at any moment. Thorn said the wind was a force that could be both friend and foe. We saw it carry rocks in its gusts, shake trees, race across the sky, invisible but palpable. It could seem light and gentle, but it was so powerful that it could destroy everything in its path. But it was not that simple. We had to figure out how to control it. The wind can be elusive, but it can also be directed, Thorn said. To conquer it, you must become part of its movement. Understand how it breathes and move with it. I will seek the windstone. We stood silently, knowing this would not be an easy test. Thorn reached the top of the hill and stretched his arms out toward the horizon. We stood behind him, watching as his arms began to move, as if he himself were becoming part of the wind. He was not just a man, he was the wind, absorbing its power. I couldn't understand what was happening. His movements were fluid, almost dance-like, but there was something more to them. He wasn't trying to resist the wind, he was becoming part of it. His body, his arms, everything moved in tune with this invisible flow. Suddenly, the wind grew stronger, as if it sensed Thor's presence. It swirled around him, raising dust from the ground, stirring leaves but not interfering. He was close, but not attacking. Thorn stepped forward, and the wind seemed to respond. It wrapped around him, and in an instant something wondrous appeared. Thorn picked up the stone. It was light, almost weightless, like a feather, yet dense and solid. It was made of the wind itself, as if the air itself had taken shape to become something tangible. The stone was strangely transparent, with iridescent light that was not from the sun, but from the wind itself, penetrating its structure. It was not just stone, it was the result of the wind, its embodiment in physical form. This stone is not just a material. It has no weight in itself, but it can be used. It will glide through the air like the wind itself, Thorn said, holding the stone in his hands. I watched as Thorn walked to the edge of the hill to try throwing the stone. I could feel the wind picking up, as if it knew what was happening. Thorn threw the stone into the air. It didn't hit the ground like I expected. The stone hung suspended in midair, as if an invisible thread were holding it in place. And as soon as the stone left his hand, the wind picked it up and carried it on, high into the sky, as if it were part of the air current itself. It was incredible. We all stood and watched as the stone, despite its lightness, moved with precision and confidence. The wind had accepted it, and now it was part of its path. I realized that the wind was not an enemy. It was part of everything that surrounded us. We might not notice it, but it was always there, in the air, in every movement. And now with this stone, we became part of its movement. Thorn came back to us, his eyes full of determination. He knew he had won, but it was not a victory in the usual sense. It was a victory over unpredictability. We had learned to work with the wind, to become part of it, rather than trying to conquer it. The wind is not something you can hold in your hands. It is something you must learn to feel and direct, he said, watching the stone slowly disappear into the horizon. It was already far away, but it did not matter. The wind had taken it, but it had left something important, the knowledge that we could move with it. As we continued on our way, I felt the wind touch my skin again, as if it were an old friend who had walked with us all this time. It was not just an element, it was our ally. We had learned to see it and feel it, and now it was a part of us. We moved on, knowing that the wind would always be with us, wherever we were. We became part of its flow, and that was the most important thing. Water was different. Where fire was bright and fierce and wind invisible and meaningful, water was quiet, almost invisible, but its power was no less great. We stood by a vast lake that stretched out before us, its surface smooth as a mirror, reflecting the sky. Water was not just an element. It was connected to life, to change, to the passage of time. Water was the source of life, but it could also be destructive. Its flow contained both creative and destructive power. We could not control it, but we had to learn to understand its laws. I knew that this element would require more than just willpower. We had to become part of the water, understand its movement, Thorn was silent. He looked out at the lake, his gaze focused, almost thoughtful. I could feel his mind absorbing every detail of this place. He knew the water demanded attention, demanded silence and inner peace. Water does not like haste, he said, his voice quiet and measured. It always finds its way. And to learn to work with it, you need to learn to move with it, not against it. I stood there trying to understand what he meant. The water could be calm, but it could also flare up, boil, flood. Its power was not to be trifled with. It could consume everything if it was not understood. And I knew that if we were not careful, it would become our enemy. Thorn, as always, made the first move. He dipped his hand into the water, and I watched his fingers glide slowly across the surface. The water seemed to accept him, gently wrapping itself around his hand, as if the water itself was seeking his touch. He dipped his hand deeper, and the water began to move around his fingers, forming circles. He watched it, slowly, but his eyes were full of attention. He was not just a man, he was part of this water. I took a step forward, dipping my hand into the lake as well. The water was cold, but not in the way I expected. It was alive, it was moving, and I could feel it moving, pulsing under my skin. It wasn't just cold. It felt like the water itself was trying to communicate with me, trying to explain how it worked. I felt like it was absorbing me, like I was becoming part of its flow. Don't resist, Thorn said, noticing my efforts. Water doesn't like resistance. It changes, but it always finds a way. Water will always flow where it needs to flow, and if you learn to be with its flow, it will take you where you need to go. I understood. I understood that the water was not trying to defeat us. It was trying to teach us to be part of it. We could not fight its flow, but move with it, allow ourselves to be part of this eternal flow. We stood in the water, immersed in its world, and everything around us was quieter, as if nature itself had frozen. The water was alive, but not intrusive. It was simply part of us. We felt its power, but we were not afraid. We knew that water could be both destructive and healing. It could carry us to new shores, but it could also drown us. Thorn stepped forward, and I followed him. We moved deeper into the lake, the water gradually covering our bodies, but we felt no fear. We moved with it, following its current. The water lulled us, its power to dissolve and renew, but not to destroy. When we reached the center of the lake, Thorn stopped. He looked at me, and I saw in his eyes a knowledge that was not words but feelings. "Do you feel it?" he asked, and I nodded. I felt the water filling me, its coldness penetrating but not killing. It was renewing me. It was cleansing me. "Water is not only life," he continued. "It is also death and change. But to understand its power, you must learn to flow with it, rather than try to hold it back." I looked at the water, and it seemed different now. It wasn't just a lake. It was a living thing, moving, changing, but always finding its way. We learned to follow it, not to fight it, and that was the most important lesson. Water lulled, calmed, but in its shadow hid an unknown power. We could be part of its power, but only if we respected its laws. Water was an element that left traces, but did not grab. We became part of it, and now we could move with it. When we returned to the shore, I felt different. The water had cleansed us, and we were ready for the next challenge. We had been through fire, through wind, and now through water. And each time we became stronger, learning to accept the elements as they were, and becoming part of their power.